We'll be starting up here in about, 2 minutes or so. Okay, good morning and welcome. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York State LTAP Center at the Quinna-Looker Roads program. And I want to welcome you to what's actually a beautiful day. I apologize. I asked for better weather for training, which means rain and a little bit cool. I got the cool, but I didn't get the rain. So uh, hopefully today you'll learn something. Today we're going to be talking about low volume road pavement design geometry. And then next week we'll be doing pavement design uh, thickness. Okay, breaking it into two parts. Um, we are going to be doing polls, as you can see at just go to www.pollev.com slash David or PE. Um, that'll also show up when we actually do the polls. So you don't have to memorize that, but you can take a couple of minutes and do that. You can also download the app, but the website can be just as easy. If you've got multiple people watching from a single site, and I know a couple of you do, you can each go in with your own phone if you want to put in your own answer, or you can do a combined answer. I don't care. My goal today is the same. Everybody walk away with something you can use and take home with you. There was a handout that was emailed to all of you. If you didn't get the handout, put that into the Q&A that you didn't get it, and we'll get it emailed out to you. Just throw your email in there. That way we know exactly where to send it. Behind the scenes, I've got Adam Howell and Amanda Link, and they'll make sure you get what you need to get us going here. Just a couple of reminders about logistics. This is a webinar format, so the chat is disabled. Okay, so if I come up here and see if my pin decides it wants to work this morning, the chat is disabled for you to put chat in. However, I do recommend you open the chat up. If later on we decide to send you a link or something, we'll throw it into that chat pod. That's how we have to do that. I may ask you to raise your hand now and then to give me some feedback, um, answering a question like a yes or a no kind of thing, or if you've got comments. There's only about 15 of us on here, so we might even be able to let you speak, but we'll play that by ear this morning as we go. The main way you're going to input is either through Poll Everywhere or the Q&A. So you can put things into the Q&A, ask questions. Please ask them as we go, and we'll try to answer them. And hopefully you'll pick something up out of this morning. Okay. For those of you who are getting professional development hours, engineers, what will happen is at the end of the 3 hours this morning, we'll see how much time y'all have spent. 3/4 or more, you'll get a certificate of attendance. 90% or more, you'll get a PDH certificate if you asked for one for professional development hours. And it's combined total. So for 3 hours, you essentially need to miss, you know, no more than 0.3 hours. You can do the math. Uh, Here's the schedule this morning. Uh, this first hour, we're going to be talking, just doing an introduction. I'm going to ask you some questions about who you are. I may get some feedback. I'll give you a little bit about my background. We're going to talk about what is a low volume road, both in the minds of the public and the elected boards, but also yourselves. We're then going to take a break. We're then going to talk about just in general low volume design standards that are out there, some of the history of them, some of the things that came out over the last 20 years in terms of low volume design. And then finally, we'll spend the last hour going through a set of low volume specifications that we support and ending with a couple of case studies and a couple of questions just to make sure everybody's on the same page. And we should be done at noon. I understand how breaks work. I understand how lunch works, so we'll definitely take those breaks. Now, to get us started, I'll go through the handout in just a second, but just to see who's here, I'm going to clear the response from the last time I did this. I'm going to ask who you work for. Okay. Choices: local government, state, FHWA, consultant, contractor, and we'll see if some of you are still working for the weekend. So as we get out of COVID, people are getting the weekends back, so they're not. It's easier to tell them apart these days. So let's just get a sense of how many of you are from each group. I did look at the list, so I have a pretty good sense of which towns are represented in counties and things like that. But okay, so 60-40, and that's about right. In terms of that, I know that, again, there are multiple people I know at a couple of sites. That's fine. Don't feel worried about that too much. I'm just trying to get a sense. If you could, now this is, I'm going to put you to work here in the Q&A section. So over in the Q&A, if you could put in there what you're hoping to get out of this class today. So what, just put over in the Q&A what you would like to see in the class. And again, I'm also doing this as much as anything to help you see the two tools we're going to use the most, which is the poll everywhere and the Q&A. So if you could put in the Q&A what you hoping to get out of this. Some design help, okay. You'd like a road to last for 20 years, okay. I will be honest, more of that will be next week with the thickness issue, but we'll certainly talk about that. When does a dirt road need to be paved? We'll also talk about that a little bit today, more next week, but we'll talk about that. Yep. And we can get the handout sent out to you, not a problem. That just takes a bit of a time. Amanda will take care of you, or Adam. Okay. So now, just because I can, let me come over here and show you the handout. I've got some other tabs open. So the handout, the main thing for you for the handout, I'll be honest with you, it's pretty short. The main thing on the handout are links to the resources we're going to be talking about today. When we emailed this out, we also emailed you a link to a couple of documents on our website, the manual guidelines for rural town and county roads, some standards we produced, and some other information from New York State DOT and AASHTO. More than anything else, those resources is probably the most valuable thing. And then, of course, a couple of pages for notes for those who like to take physical notes. Okay. Okay, so now, before we get going too forth, great question in the Q&A. Low volume road versus high volume. What is the cutoff? That's actually how we're going to start. We're going to start with talking about those definitions, and I want to get your thoughts. Before I talk about low volume versus high volume, however, okay, what I would like you to think about is, just in general, okay, see if my computer will wake up here. What is a road? Okay, so you can type in an answer. It's not a single word. You can put in, what is a road? What would you define as a road? So put in the poll everywhere. It's pollev.com/DavidOrPE. Or as I say, you could download the app or text it once you join if you'd like. But what is a road? How would, if somebody asks you what's a mean to travel somewhere? Okay, yep. helps us get from point A to point B. A stabilized surface for transportation, yeah, that's a pretty good definition. Let me get a couple more. While you do that, I'm going to pour myself a cup of coffee. I forgot to do that before we got started. A pathway for vehicles, yeah. A route to move goods from A to B. Okay, guess if we can get one more. A route to travel from one location to another, yeah. There's lots of definitions about what a prepared surface, yeah. Okay, put my creamer in and then we'll see what other ones. A modified surface to facilitate travel, yeah. If you've been to many of our sessions, especially sessions that I've done, you've probably seen the next picture I'm going to show you as soon as I find where I put my mouse. A safe route to travel, yeah. This is a picture that came from ARTBA, the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, in a book that they produced, and then we got it electronically. Uh, this is what a lot of roads look like in rural areas over 100 years ago in the early part of the 1900s. And there was a movement called the Good Roads Movement that came out to get roads in better shape, which led to the farm to market roads, the concept of getting the farmer out of the mud. Um, the concept was the same though. You got to have good drainage, you got to have prepare a surface, and a road is a structure. And if you do that, you can transport pretty heavy vehicles across some pretty soft subgrades. And that's the key is we're trying to have a prepared surface that's got some strength to it to carry very heavy loads efficiently and effectively. So a road really is a transportation corridor. It is a structure and something we need to think about. And next week we'll be spending more time on the structural part, but it's something to keep in the back of our brain that that structure also has a geometric component as well. And so I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we get too far down the road. Okay? Now, we talked about what is a road. I'm going to let you one word. This time we'll get one of those little clouds. They're called wordles, by the way, if you're wondering what that is defined as. One word. What is a low volume road? It's not the volume. We'll come back to the volume. What one word? If somebody said to you, give me an adjective that sort of tells us what is a low volume road, what would that one word be? And again, not the volume. I don't want a number. We'll come back to the number of how many vehicles. I'll definitely answer that question. Trucks, okay. Rural, okay, that's a very common one. Narrow, yeah, okay. Let's see what else we get. And I think you could put in more than one. I can't remember if I set it up that way. Let's see what other ones you come up with. Clear, okay. Gravel, yeah, that's very unpaved, yeah, very common. A lot of people think of low volume roads as being gravel roads. Okay. Bumpy. A lot of people think of low volume as being bumpy. We do tend to let them be a little bit more bumpy, a little rougher than we would a main road, but hopefully they're not too bumpy. Tend to be winding, a little sharper geometry. Yeah, and that's what we're going to spend most of today talking about is the geometry. Yeah. Okay. So you can imagine there's all kinds of words that people use for defining what is a low volume road. But what I want to talk a little bit about is the myths behind that and whether they're low volume or not. So I'm going to show you 4 roads to start with that all would meet the definition of low volume that we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so these are 4 examples. Okay, we'll come back to these in more detail, but let's look at these. Now, I see we have our friends from Lewis County here. This is one of your roads. I hope it's in better shape today than when I took the picture. I think it's West Road or West Avenue, or it's an old state road down there. Um, and it's definitely got some drainage issues. The road was narrowed and widened out. And that's actually very common on a lot of our low volume roads. We've made them wider over time without building the structure up underneath. And that's both a geometric and a structural issue. So when we're talking about geometry today, it's something I want to make sure we are on the same page. Okay. This is a fairly narrow town road. I live on a road that looks a lot like this, narrow, one lane, barely can pass, but serves the needs of the people on it. Okay. Here's one that's also up in the North Country. It's a town road, uh, pretty wide because of the traffic that uses it, the service that's on it. And even within an urban area, a lot of the villages and small cities here in New York State have low volume streets. Okay. So while we're talking about officially low volume roads, we're actually going to talk also about low volume streets because the reality is there's a lot of them out there and they have some of the same characteristics and some of the same concerns. Okay. And I know some of you are from some of those communities that are on that margin between rural and urban areas. And so, something for us to keep in mind as we're thinking about what is low volume. Okay. So, let's go through some of the answers that you gave and some of the ones that we've picked up over the years and just talk about whether they really truly are low volume. And then we'll come back to what is the defining number for low volume here in a minute. One of the most common things people use is the word local. By far, in fact, sometimes people use those interchangeably. But local actually has a specific definition to it. Okay, so we'll come back to that. A lot of people think of it as rural. We've heard that in our Wordle or out in the country. Um, that's what a lot of people think. Oh, that's rural. That's a low volume road. But obviously, the interstate system belies that because most of the interstates out in the country, it's out in the rural areas. It doesn't make it low volume. Residential, generally in an urban area, a village, or a suburban town, a residential street does have less traffic on it than an main road does, but it doesn't mean it necessarily would be low volume. So have to balance that activity. We saw gravel on the list, and generally, yes, a gravel road is probably low volume because the economics will tell us we should be paving it if you get too much traffic on it. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Slow speed. Nobody said that. This is mainly because we're dealing with a bunch of highway folks. If I ask this question of elected officials and citizens, a lot of them say slow speed for low volume. And you and I both know that sometimes low volume, they actually go faster. In fact, in the last year and a half with COVID, we actually found traffic volumes went way down, but speeds went way up. And so our fatalities actually were higher in the last year and a half than they had been in years. And the rate for fatalities has jumped dramatically because of speed. And if you look at the low volume roads, they actually have a higher crash rate than higher volume roadways. A lot of times it's not because of the design, it's because of the human factors, but we'll talk about that a little bit today. The key is to think about this is in some respects it's defined by the road users. There is a number, but we need to think about the road users, whatever the volume is, and design the road to match those people, okay, that are actually using the roadway. So what I want to do is I want to go through those definitions. And again, if you have any questions, please ask as we go. So let's start with local. Now, local is one of the most confusing terms that we have in the highway community because local actually has two very distinct, different definitions. And then there's the term that people think about when they use the term local, just the general and the public. Okay. So in the Q&A, can somebody put in the Q&A what Federal Highway Administration and the New York State Department of Transportation would define as a local road? What do they define as local? Okay. In the Q&A, if somebody could put in there, what is a local according to FHWA or the New York State Department of Transportation? One way to define it is under municipal jurisdiction. So in New York State, that would be maintained by a town, a county, a village, or a city. Okay, so that would be a local road owned and maintained by a local jurisdiction. So this is actually in the city of Ithaca. It's near where I live. On one of my morning walks, I took this photograph. And this is actually a state touring route but it's actually maintained by the city of Ithaca. There's that new program that the state put out to help provide some funding for those state touring routes, and this is why. Now, sometimes, like in this particular case, this is also a federal aid road, and so it's not eligible under that program because it gets federal dollars. Okay. But yeah, one way to define it is municipal jurisdiction. The other way to define it, and FHWA uses this one as well, and that is a local road serves a local area and it's not a collector or an arterial. So the arterials would be the main roads connecting cities, the interstate system, the national highway system. Collectors collect traffic. Mostly in New York State, you can almost say county roads, but it's not perfectly consistent. Okay. And then everything else that's bringing the local traffic to the collectors is a local road. And you can actually go on the web and type in functional classification. And New York State actually has a map system that they've got. You can actually look that up. We actually will do that for traffic volume here in just a couple of minutes. But the problem with that definition, and one of the reasons it's such a challenge for us, is everyone wants to live on a local road, and in their mind, they live on a local road. The people in my neighborhood who live on this street, which is really an minor arterial, according to Federal Highway Administration, think of it as their local street because that's where they live. And that creates some conflict for a lot of things. So local is a challenge that we just have to keep in mind. And of course, the public's mind of what local is may not be low volume. This particular road is over 5,000 vehicles a day. Certainly not low volume by any definition. Out in the country, you see that all the time when people say low volume road, they think, oh, it's out in the country, it's rural, 2 lane. And that may or may not be a local road, but it may or may not be a low volume road as well. And it really depends on, again, the use and the volume. This happens to be a county road that connects 2 state roads, okay? And the traffic volumes on this are actually pretty high because a lot of people use it to come to Ithaca from the Rochester area. They're coming down, or from Geneva. You cut over near Lodi, and it's actually shortens your time up, and you come in one side of Ithaca versus another, or one corner. Certainly not low volume. Out in the country does not definitely define low volume. Okay. Residential, again, back in the city of Ithaca, I'm on my morning walks, and this could be a town, it could be a village, it could be a city. Residential is very commonly used. It is lower volume typically, but again, people who live on that other city street, they think of it as a local residential street, and they want people to drive that way, and it creates a bit of a conflict. But yes, a lot of times residential, we think of it that way. But again, if it's purely residential, low volume or not, how people drive, how they behave, whether they allow parking or not, changes. Okay? So when you start thinking about this, and we're going to come back to this theme again and again, what's along the side of the roadway should really define how the roadway works and is used and maintained. And you'll see that that's actually something that we can take advantage of. Gravel, there's a lot of discussions out there. There's actually a lot of research out there about what is a defining point between when you should pave a road and when you should leave it gravel. Okay. Now we're going to come back to what a low volume road is, but if your agency has gravel roads in your system, can you raise your hand? Go down at the bottom and raise your hand. Let me see if anybody has any gravel roads. Okay. So a few of you have gravel roads. Okay. And I can see, and some of you are with counties. Okay. So for those of you that have gravel roads, or even if you don't, what traffic volume do you think is a good cutoff? So you put in the Q&A, this time you'll put a number in. We're not defining low volume yet. But when is it cheaper to pave it versus leave it gravel? When do you think it's cheaper to pave it versus leave it gravel? What traffic volume? $20 a day? Okay. That's not an atypical answer, Tim. I'll be totally honest with you. There's lots of research out there, and it really varies a lot. If you go on our website, and I'll give you that at the end, you have it in the handout. Just search for gravel, and one of our publications is a publication put out by the South Dakota LTAP Center. It has a federal highway mark on it, but it was actually written by the South Dakota LTAP Center. And it's on gravel road maintenance and operations and design. There's actually two versions of it. The older version I like because it has references. The newer version is a little more modern in terms of updates, but it talks about when to pave and when not to pave. And it's not a simple number, but a number is a good place to start from because you got to look at the type of traffic. Trucks are different than cars. The biggest thing I want to make sure we don't forget about, though, is when we pave that road, we have to think about how it's going to hold up, how it's going to work. Okay? But a gravel road, there are reports anywhere from as few as a dozen vehicles a day or less, up to several hundred vehicles a day is the cutoff point. But what it really comes down to is your maintenance and your operations. If, for instance, you're with a county and you've got 200 and something miles of roadway and you've only got one gravel road mile left, it's probably worth it to transfer that to being at least chip sealed so you could treat it like a paved road from an operational standpoint than having to deal with one section of gravel road. But that's not always feasible. But a lot of people think of low volume and gravel as synonymous. They're similar, but there are some differences. And there are roads in parts of the world that have hundreds of vehicles a day, heavy trucks that are still gravel. But you got to be careful on those with dust and softness when it rains and things like that. We typically think of low volume and slow speed as synonymous, but they're not. Whether you're in urban areas or rural areas, speed is not a direct surrogate for traffic volume. In fact, a lot of times we put in traffic calming, which is a whole different class, specifically because we've got that conflict between we really want people to be slow because it is a residential area or there's really no need to be going that fast versus there's a demand that people want to go past a certain location and people tend to speed. So there's that balancing act. Speed and volume and safety are actually not surrogates of each other. They're correlations, there's relationships, but be careful. And we'll talk a lot about safety as we talk about some of these standards as we go along. Okay. What I really want to make sure we're understanding is if you really think about it, the design of the road should be driven by the road user. Okay. So that road user could be the residents who live along that roadway. It could be the travelers who go from point A to point B, commuting every day to work or going to school. It could be truckers and commercial vehicles taking goods from market to market and supplying us with food and groceries and things like that. It could be taxpayers who have nothing to do with that particular roadway. You know, if you're in the town of Ithaca, uh, the taxpayers who live up in the northern part of the town on the eastern side are still paying some taxes for a road that's 20 miles away. If you're in a county, it could be 40, 50 miles away, but they're still paying taxes. And so you have to sort of keep that in the back of your mind. And of course, those of you who are with towns, about 90% of the towns in New York State are elected, and this is an election year for highway superintendents. So about half the highway superintendents in the state are up for election. They have to think about the voters. And the voters may or may not be direct taxpayers, but they certainly are affected by those taxes. So you have a balancing act. There is no right or wrong answer on what is the most critical of these road users. But when we're thinking about low volume design, we should be thinking about who's using the road and who's asking for certain things. Okay? So I have a good question here in the Q&A. Let's just look at it real quick. If a road is dirt and requires a lot of maintenance, when does it make sense to convert to gravel, an oil and chip road? And they call that, by the way, depaving. And we're actually going to talk about that. Let me just see when we talk about that. That is in That's in the third hour. We'll be talking about that. So, Joseph, don't let me forget to bring that back up, but we are definitely going to be talking lot more about when to pave, when does it make sense to convert from gravel to paved and vice versa. And we'll also do a little bit of that next week when we talk about thickness. Okay, and there is an analysis that can be performed. So we will be talking about that. But don't let me forget, I'm going to clear your answer for now, but we will be definitely talking about that. Of course, it comes back to traffic. Now, this is a picture taken by the county official in Lee County, Iowa. His name is Ben Hull. There's an international conference on low volume roads that's held every 4 years. The last time it was held was in Montana, and the next time it's being held in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So I'm on the committee. We're starting to put together the program and some marketing, of course. And so one of the things we wanted is some pictures of roads from Iowa. Now, while we haven't moved something this heavy uh, out here, we've moved some pretty heavy stuff. And sometimes that stuff is on the main roads, the state highways. I've seen some generators come through Ithaca and up through Preble and things like that. But at the same time, they sometimes have to get off onto the local system. And that still could be low volume. It's only a couple of trips. But imagine every one of those axles has 8 wheels. They're all independent. And that's a lot of loads at the wrong time of year can do a lot of damage. And we'll talk about that a lot next week. But think about the geometry that you need to handle that. Yeah, as Tim says, you got windmills. You got to bring those blades in. You got to be able to make the corner. And the geometry of that road is going to change. The thickness of that road is going to change. So these are all issues. So now you keep asking. So now here's your opportunity to put in what is a low volume road. I'm going to let you put in your number for what is a low volume road. And we'll see how this works. Because I think it's supposed to be you put a number and people are able to rank it, but I'm not sure how it works. I've not used this particular polling technique before. So we're going to see how that works. $3,000, less than 3,000, okay. Less than 200, 1,000, okay. So people are putting in words as well as they're putting in numbers. Okay, we got a 3,000 to 2,000 to 250. 1,000 is waiting at the moment. Okay. At the Transportation Research Board, there is a committee on low volume roads. I serve on that committee at the moment. They cycle people. I like the way they do that. I served on it once before, and I'm back on it again. And there are huge debates about defining this line of what is a low volume roadway. And I'm going to show you over the course of the day the two most common lines that are used. Surprisingly, most of the public likes 1,000, but 1,000 is not the one that was settled on by AASHTO and some of the other committees that are out there looking at this. There's two numbers. They're centered, they're on each side of 1,000. So 1,000 is a pretty good number when you're talking to the public, but we'll come back to the two numbers that are used by lots of people. Okay. So now what do? We sort of got a number. We're in the 1,000 vehicle range. We know that we got to worry about different kinds of road users, what's going on around the roadway. So now what? Well, we need to develop appropriate standards. Okay. And so I just want to briefly touch on why it's so important to have appropriate standards. Because this is usually where I see problems when I've traveled around New York State and actually talked to my colleagues at other LTAP centers across the country. The reason you need standards is pretty clear when you start thinking about it. Now, I'm going to see what your answers are, and then I'll go through my list that I've generated over the years. But again, why do you need standards? So again, put it into the Q&A. Why you need standards? What are the reasons why you need standards? I hope you have them, but I'll let you decide that decision. But would you decide there? And I think this one is, I can't remember again if this is a single word one or a multiple word one. Design limitations, again, if you want to put in the Q&A because you don't have the poll everywhere up, that's fine. We can make that work. So either go to pollev.com/DavidOrPE, or you could put it in the Q&A if you prefer. So quality is one. Yeah, quality is actually one of the most important reasons we need standards. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Guidelines. It's guidelines, communication, continuity. Yeah, you don't want like the interstate they had in Kansas to, I think it was Kansas to Colorado, where the interstate stopped for many years. So you went from a two-lane road to a full interstate. Communication can be an issue. Yeah. Hmm. Standardized maintenance. Yeah. Safety. Yeah. Safety is actually one of the most important reasons why. Okay. Let's see how y'all did here. I think you're actually doing a pretty good job at getting all the items that are on my list. There are a couple that we missed. Designed for inspection, consistency. Okay. Okay. Pretty good. Budget. Yeah, money. Money is one of them. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about these items a little bit. I bring it up, like it or not, liability becomes an issue. You really want to reduce your liability. You don't want to get sued because you've got a pretty good road, but somebody else wants to hold you to a different standard. So if you have no standard and something happens, a crash, we'll talk about that in the next slide. But if you've got no standards and something happens and there's a lawsuit, what's going to happen is the lawyers involved are going to try to hold you to somebody else's standards, possibly. So, do your roads meet the federal and or state DOT level standards? And if they don't, can you defend them in court? So having appropriate standards can really help you when it comes to court, especially if those have the standards of a national agency behind them. Because now in court, someone would have to show that your standards are inadequate. And if they've got a national imprinter behind them, you're in great shape. From a liability standpoint, one of the best reasons to have standards. But just as important, and I think even more important in my mind, is safety. Good standards improve safety. And even on a low volume road, good consistent standards really help from a safety standpoint. Well, we talked about crash rates being higher, and they are a lot higher on the low volume road system. A lot of those crashes occur at certain types of locations and places that don't even meet the standards we're talking about today. So, really important from a safety standpoint, and we'll definitely talk about the fact consistency is important. Planning. Tim, you mentioned earlier that you've got a lot of windmills. Whether you've got development, windmills, or just farm vehicles, having a planning process in place can help you with your standards so you slowly upgrade everything to a consistent roadway system. And looking long term, how do you upgrade all of your roadways to meet a consistent standard if you don't have one? So, from a planning standpoint, it's important. And of course, that comes back to the development process. Whether you're bringing in Walmart, windmills, fracking if it's ever allowed again, heavy vehicles like we saw from Iowa, all of these development factors, if you've got standards, you can deal with that. And geometric and thickness are part of that standard process. Someone mentioned quality. Quality control is absolutely vital. But if you don't know what you're building to, if you don't know what your standards are, how do you have any quality control? If you know you want a 20-foot width and somebody tries to put a subdivision with only 18-foot wide roadways, that could be a problem. And so it gives you something to measure against. And of course, all of this comes back to economics, money. Money isn't driver of a lot of things. I'm glad to see nobody put money down as their first choice. It isn't mine ever, but it is something we have to think about. And part of the reason for that is pretty simple. Now, I will tell you right now, these numbers are about 4 years old. They might have changed some. We have new numbers. I've downloaded them, and over the summer, I will update this sheet. This is from 2017 data. I've got more recent data, 2019. Yeah, it's usually about 2 years behind. 60% of the towns, the 933 towns in the state, though these data were from when there were 932 towns, spend 50% of more or more of their annual budget on roads. So if you take the total town budget and you pull out the things that are highway, over 50% of the budget is true in 60% of the towns. So obviously that's a pretty important factor that we have to deal with. So what do we do? What are the choices to reduce the cost or at least control them a little bit? You could transfer the road to another agency. Um, that used to be done, actually. If you look at the history of the roads in New York State, that was actually done fairly often. The idea behind it actually makes sense if you think about it. What was happening 100 years ago, back before there was a county highway system, so it's actually now about 110 years. Towns maintained all the rural roads, villages and cities maintained all the urban things, and there was a state system on top of it. Then there was a county system that was added on top of that, and I'm not going to get into all the history. It's a pretty fun one, though. But back then, roads got moved around all the time, and if you started looking at it carefully, you started realizing what was happening was the state was going to maintain the arterials, the counties were going to pick up all the collector roads, a little bit higher volume, more trucks, and the towns and the villages were going to maintain all of the local roads by functional classification. And so roads would get transferred around. But over time, that has stopped. So I worked in Yates County for 8 years, and there's actually a town road in the town of Potter that runs along the west side of the Flint Creek. It's a swampy, very good farmland area that was supposed to become a county road. It's actually a federal aid road. It's low volume, even by any of our definitions these days. But it never got transferred out because that was about the time we stopped doing that. It was supposed to be a collector type roadway. It never got transferred over. So now the town has more of a collector, and the county kept a couple of roads that are probably more local in their nature. We don't do it as much as we used to. Um, we could reduce the number of roads in the system. That's not going to happen very often. More commonly, what's happening is we just don't add roads to the system. If you are adding roads, make sure the roads are built to your standard, both geometrically and thickness-wise. Okay? What I want to focus on is implementing good standards that actually saves you money. Much like maintaining your fleet, maintaining your roads is cheaper. Um, we won't get into too much detail on that, but you'll all understand the idea of pavement and asset management. We'll talk a little bit about the idea of the minimum maintenance road here in a little bit when we get to the appropriate standard. But it's a technique that can be used. And yes, I know there are court cases on both sides of whether that's allowed or not. It's very commonly used out in the western part of the country, and it still should probably be something that's in your toolkit as we're moving forward. All of this comes back to adopting appropriate standards, which is what we're focused on today. We're starting with geometrics. And I hope everybody has a good risk management plan in place to reduce your level of risk. And the standards, as we talked earlier, will help you there. Now, really, if you think about it, everything I've talked about today and everything we're talking about in some respects comes back to communication. A good set of standards communicates to the public what the expectations are. So it really is a communication issue. And when people ask me what the three most important things in roads is, I usually jokingly say drainage, drainage, and drainage. But actually, truth be told, my big three are almost always the same. The order might change slightly, but it's usually safety, drainage, and communications. You do those three things well, everything else gets pretty easy. So what are we going to do if we want to adopt an appropriate standard? What's the implementation process? Well, first, we have to adopt the appropriate standard. And that's what we're actually going to be doing here. We're going to be talking about some possible appropriate standards after our first break, though. Actually, we'll probably start with a little bit of that discussion before the first break. To do that, you have to know what those standards are and then make sure they work on your system. You need to go in and you need to classify all of your local roads, okay? Because when you're dealing with low volume roads, you have to define whether that road fits more as low volume or not. So what standards is it going to fall into? Because your standards are going to have some variation, some ranges into it. So you're going to have to classify all of your local, and that what I really mean there is all of your jurisdictions roadways. So if you're with a town, all the town roads. If you're with a city, the city roads or streets. And if you're with a county, it would be the county road or highway system. Okay. You need to determine the existing conditions. And in this case, we're talking geometric conditions. What are the geometric issues that you've got to deal with? You've got to identify your needs, what needs to be upgraded and improved. Okay. And that, just like any asset management plan, is important. And then you're going to rank and prioritize the work. So you'll slowly bring your roadways up to your appropriate standards. Okay. That means you need to develop an action plan. So developing standards is not the end game. The end game is having an action plan in place to adopt and use those appropriate standards on your whole road system. So what does the public need? Okay. So I'm going to show you 3 roads, and I'm going to show you something that happens way too often as I travel around New York State. And I can tell you right now, I've seen this in a lot of jurisdictions, and I'm hoping I'll dissuade you from doing this. I know it's tempting, but I'm going to show you 3 roads, and I'm going to let you choose one road as your agency standard. Okay? So road number 1 is this road right here. Okay? It's 10 feet wide between the little bit places where people don't drive. Okay? That's one choice. Okay? Choice number 2 is 22 feet wide between the white stripes when they aren't worn off at the end of winter. Okay? The actual traveled way. Or 36 feet curb to curb. Okay, so I'm going to let you choose. And again, here we're going to go to our poll. And I'm going to ask you to vote. If you could only choose one, what would you choose? Okay, we're getting a bunch of votes. Okay. And some people are putting into the Q&A again. Again, if you don't have poll EV, you can use the Q&A. So by far, most of you, if you could only choose one answer, you're choosing B, 22 feet. Okay. And I don't blame you. For most of our road systems, that's probably not, the end of the world. But if you think about it, if it's a low volume, residential only, 10 feet may be enough. In fact, this is the road I live on. It's Vine Street. That's actually a little odd history, but I'm not going to get into that. But it's only 10 feet, but it serves the need of the people on it. This is a road in Yates County. When I was at Yates County, 22 feet was our standard. And that's actually a problem. We should have variations that deal with reality. If you're in the city of Ithaca, 36 feet curb to curb, if you're allowing parking, is probably what you need in a lot of cases, especially if there's buses and it's a higher volume roadway outside that. So if you only had one, yeah, you'd probably pick a number like a 22. But the reality is your standards need to have variation in them. Now, maybe not this much, but the idea is have some variations. So when it comes to low volume road design standards, you know, some of your roads, 12 feet may be all you need. This is a seasonal limited use highway, minimum maintenance road. Yes, it's both. We'll talk about why when we get to minimum maintenance. But 12 feet is fine for this particular stretch of highway. It doesn't need to be anything wider than that, beyond the point of the seasonal limited use or minimum maintenance road section. But if you turn around, literally I just turned around, it's 16 feet wide, serving a residence. And that's great. That's what they need to serve that residence, to get vehicles in and out. 2 vehicles can pass, low speed, works out well. You need to have a variation, not a single number for every single roadway in your system. That actually leads to, while it's consistent, it actually leads to more liability, lower safety, and doesn't serve the need of the public. Now, what are appropriate standards? They're clear and easy to understand. I've seen way too many complicated standards. When I first got here to the LTAP Center here at Cornell, one of my first tasks was to develop standards, which we now support, and you'll got a copy of, and we'll talk about quite a bit after the first hour and the second hour. I asked folks to send me standards, and I don't know what you've got for standards in your own system, but please do me a favor and remember they need to be clear and easy to understand. I'd much rather have a 4 or 5 page consistent clean standard than one that's too long. But it does have to have enough detail in it to be able to define what your standards are. I got standards that were, in one case, the entire town road standard was one paragraph. Probably not enough. I got another one was several hundred pages long. And if you actually read it, you'd see things in there about catch basins and water pits and water lines in a rural town which had none of those. Somebody had brought it from another municipality and it wasn't appropriate. It needs to meet the needs of the public without undue expense. There's no need to make the road wider than you absolutely need. And this is the last point, is the one I really want to emphasize. You should use it for all roads. If you adopt a standard, that's the road standard you want a private developer to follow. And yes, the town can set standards to a private developer, even if the town's never going to take that roadway over under zoning rules. And it's actually important. And it's also important to define that is also your standard when you rebuild the roadway. You know, if you've got a roadway you're going to reconstruct, you want to bring it up to that standard. So that's why it's very important that you use it for all of your roadway system. And somebody put in their standards that needed to meet fire access apparatus standards for the building code. Yeah, these standards do that. And your standards do need to follow, again, the use on the roadway. Okay. And that's important. When you rebuild the roadway, are you bringing it up to that standard? Okay. So let me ask you a question. And I'll let you put this one in the Q&A today. Yeah, I just did it in the Q&A. Okay. I just wrote a quick spec out. It's COVID. You know, a lot of people did this, not necessarily the way they should have, but they're asking for a four-legged animal to provide companionship. What are they asking for? What are they asking for? If they're asking for a four-legged animal to provide companionship. I think I've stumped them, Jacob. Nobody wants to put in the Q&A what I'm thinking about. They can't read my mind. Todd thinks it's a dog. Dog's a good guess. A lot of people adopted dogs. Typically, it's a dog or a cat, but there is quite a difference between a dog or a cat. And by the way, the most common four-legged animal to provide companionship at Cornell University, and lots of students have them and they posted lots of pictures all year long, was rabbits. The key I make here is simple. When you develop standards, whether it's for equipment, whether it's for roads, for anything, try to write them in clear, easy to understand language and ask for what you want. If you want a cat, say cat. If you want a gravel surface, because that's what you really want, then say gravel surface. If you want a paved surface, say a paved surface. Okay? Use clear, appropriate language. Now, will it have jargon in it? Yeah, I'm going to show you a standard, and it's going to have jargon. I guarantee you. You can't get away from that. But define the jargon, define the technical terms in clear, appropriate language. So even when you use it, everybody understands what you mean. Okay? Now, in terms of appropriate, again, as I've said before, and I will say it again, it's used for all the roads. It's used for developments coming in, and it's used for existing highways. Why is that important, by the way? What reasons beyond just consistency and communication? What other reasons could there be to have your appropriate standards used for new developments as well as for your existing highways? Why do you think that's a good idea? I'm going to clear these answers. Why is it important? This is actually a pretty important point when you decide to adopt whatever standards are the ones I'm going to show you. It's pretty important that you use it for all your roadways, including your own work on your own road system when you're reconstructing. It's you maintain the roadway aspect. The public doesn't necessarily know or care. Yeah, that's important. Yeah. It's even got one more answer for me. Because this is something I've seen going around the state, and I think it's pretty important to make sure we understand this. You can't adopt a standard, tell others to follow it, without having a reasonable standard that's close on your own. I'm going to show you two roadways, and I'm going to show you both roadways first, and then I'm going to come back and ask you which one is the development and which one is the town road. Okay, so I'm going to show you two roads. This is road number 1. Okay, this is road number 2. Okay, so I'm going to go back to road number 1. Raise your hand if you think that's the town road. Nobody's being brave today. Or they don't think it's the town road. Okay, so nobody voted for that one. How about this one? Does everybody think that's a town road? A lot of you think this is the town road. Most of you, in fact. Why do you think this is the town road versus the other one? Why do you think one's a town road and the other's? You know, by half of you voted the American way. Half of you voted, and most of you voted for this one being the town road. The vegetation on the verges, yeah, could be. Yeah, it's a little older looking, but nobody's going to argue that the surface of that roadway is in great shape, and the width isn't much different. Okay, so yeah, this is the development. You were right. Very good. But geometrically, they're almost exactly the same. Um, the problem is if you don't have a set of standards that you follow and you ask others to follow it, you can actually lose in court. And it has happened. The developer has said, wait a second, they're telling me I have to build to this standard and they don't do it themselves. And courts have ruled in favor of the developer. So if you've got a set of standards, you need to follow them yourself. Now, the standards we can talk about are geometric. There are maintenance standards, there's material standards, there's construction standards. And next week we'll talk also about thickness as well, so design standards. The main one for construction materials, there's a link in your handout, is the State DOT's standard specifications for construction materials. There's the Highway Design Manual, which we'll talk a bit about as we go through the course of the next 2 hours. Lots of good standards out there. And those maintenance standards cover everything from surface all the way up to signs. You know, you may have your traffic sign handbook or your MUTCD. You need to have good standards in every single case. Okay. Last question, then we're going to take ourselves a break. Okay. And I'm going to make a note because I always try to remember that. In the Q&A, do you have adopted standards for each of these items? So do you have a surface standard? Do you have a drainage standard? Do you have standards for bridges? Do you know which standard you follow for signs? Most of these are already defined for you, but yeah, so yes, and that's fine. The answer should be yes. The MUTCD, you plead the fifth, that's fine. That's cool. I'm hoping, if anything, by the time we're done today, that you start thinking about developing and or adopting standards. Start with standards others have developed. Don't go out and make extra work for yourself. DOT standards are a great place to start, but as we're going to talk in the second hour, they may not be appropriate for a lot of your road system, but there may be alternatives. Maybe a fellow county or fellow township, a village, uh, somebody else might have something that you could adopt. Okay. And yeah, it doesn't have to necessarily be staying in the same state, but the key is understanding the background behind it more than anything else. And yes, I know many towns that are along the border with Connecticut and Vermont and Pennsylvania that have adopted and used standards from across the border. Make sure it's appropriate and that the contracting community understands it as well. Okay. Now, we're going to start back up. We're going to take our break. We're going to start back up, and I'm going to spend the hour talking about geometric standards that are out there. Okay. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the history of geometric standards and help you understand where we're headed for developing your own geometric standards. And now, through the magic of this works, we're going to start back up at 9:45. Okay. Right on schedule. And we'll see you in 15 minutes. I'm going to go dark and mute and pour my second cup of coffee. See you in 15 minutes. Okay. We'll be starting back up here in about a minute. And Amanda, I promised I'd find you that picture of the valley with the fall colors. It's now my background. Okay, we're going to get started back up now. And what I want to do this hour is talk a little bit about some appropriate geometric standards that exist for local and, more importantly, low volume roadways. But the key is what makes a good appropriate standard. We talked a lot about that before the break, but what I really want to do is talk about the history and some existing standards that you can use and you may need to use for your higher volume roadways, but also the history of how our roads got to where they are. Now, you may have heard of something called the AASHTO Greenbook. Uh, it is American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, AASHTO. It used to be the American Association of State Highway Officials, so AASHTO. And the original construction and design procedures actually fell into that procedure. But the Greenbook comes about for a very interesting reason. Uh, there used to be two books that they put out. They put out one that was rural, yellow, and they put out one that was urban, blue. They decided a lot of times there's an awful lot of places where it's hard to tell the two apart. And even with the standards I'm going to show you, there's some overlap. So what do? Well, you combine them into one document. The color you get is green, and guess what? That is literally how we got the Green Book. And while today it's a soft cover that's 8.5 by 11, this is the one I purchased when I was with the county. I still have it in my office, but with my own funds because I wanted to make sure I had a good copy. And I've got older versions, the yellow book and the blue book, and the more current ones that have got the pictures of different places on it. But the idea is simple. Having a set of consistent standards we can use. But this is for every single road, from a resource recovery road that serves just getting back up into where the water plant is or the sewer plant is, to the interstate system. It's a huge book and can be very complicated and may not be appropriate. But before we get into the AASHTO standard, let me ask you, what are the critical design factors? Okay. Now this one I'm pretty sure works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you another of these poll everywhere things, and I want you to put in what you think of the design criteria from the AASHTO Green Book. What do we actually use to define everything else? Okay. So as an example, with our four-legged companion, we would be defining four legs. We would be defining whether they have fur or not. Things like that. What are the design criterion from AASHTO? So put something in, and then after people put a few in, you can rank them. Okay, let's see what we do. So I'm going to let you try this out, and this should be a little fun. So again, put in your design criterion, and put in and then you can vote, upvote or downvote them, and see what you think. Okay, let's see how this works. So traffic volume is one of the things people think about, safety, design speed, and you can upvote it once someone puts in one. Upvote it and see what you come up with. Okay. Geometry. Okay. And by the way, just so you know, there are 3 correct answers here, if you actually know the Green Book's history. Grades. Okay. Yeah. Another way to say that, by the way, might be terrain. Okay. Grades or terrain would be a possibility. Okay. Sight distance, geometry, safety, design speed. So far, the only person who's upvoted anything is ADT. So a bearing capacity, now we're talking geometrics right now. The Greenbook is completely on geometrics. It doesn't deal with thickness. That's a different standard. It would be a standard for thickness. So I'm going to do something here just because we'll talk about that next week, but I'm going to hide it for now. And axle loads, the same thing. Those are all very important standards, but we'll be talking about them next week. Whoops. There we go. Okay, so geometry, ADT, road classification, grade, sight distance, safety, design speed. Okay, and again, the ones y'all have upvoted are geometry, road classification. Not a lot of votes, but a few votes. Okay, it's important to understand where standards start from. Where do they go? What actually defines how we get to that particular location? And while most people would probably think that design speed is a design criterion, it actually is not. So let's go through what the AASHTO Greenbook uses for designing roadways. How do we get started? You know, like in a culvert, is it inlet or outlet control? For roads, the Greenbook, what does that do? And by the way, if you're wondering, the state has a standard that follows very closely to the AASHTO Greenbook with some minor modifications. It's called the Highway Design Manual. So if you're interested, you can get the Highway Design Manual, and there's a link to that. It's pretty easy to find off the web. So the three criteria. The first one is, as you said, classification. Functional classification, going all the way back to the first hour when we talked about how does FHWA and DOT define roadways. One of the reasons they define roadways by functional class is so they can design the roadway. What are the standards that we follow? So the three choices are arterials, collectors, and local roads or streets. So an arterial, as we said, connects major cities, the national highway system, the interstate system. 5 and 20. In Ithaca, Route 13, State Route 13 is an arterial roadway. Then there are collectors that collect traffic from the local roads and take it to the arterials. So a lot of the state highways, 366 going through Ithaca is a collector. You all know the collectors. A lot of county roads, not all, but a lot of county roads typically are collectors. And then there's the local roads that come into play. So one of the first things you have to know is arterial, collector, or local. But let's be honest. So an awful lot of roads where there's a lot of people living there, we actually define as collectors. You can actually, again, you can go on the web, and let me pull up my website here and type this in and see if my brain worked today. And it's, you can actually go on the web, just type functional classification, New York State DOT, and watch this, I'll bring this down here. And you can actually get maps to look at that. And they actually have a interactive GIS-based functional classification viewer that will let you look at which roads in your community are what functional classification. Okay? So somebody want me to look up a road for them that they're not sure about? So you got to give me the town you're in or the city or the county, and then also the name of the road, and we'll see if we can find it just to show you how this works. Put it in the Q&A for me. It's a pretty cool tool. Okay? Honus Lane, the town of Ithaca. Okay, we can do Honus Lane. I even know where that one is. Someone else said Maple Ave. You could do anything, but let's just go in here. So we go into Tompkins. You can zoom in. You can also search. Okay, so Honus Lane is down here because I live in this area. And if you get down to Honus Lane, for those who are wondering, is, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but it's the vertical line that's, or horizontal line that's right here between the red and the green. The green is an arterial. The red, which is Pine Tree Road, is also an arterial. A lot of people who live on that road don't want it to be an arterial, but that's what it's defined as. Honus Lane is defined as a local road or a local street. Okay, so that would be local. And if I pull out a little bit, you can actually see just by colors. The red, which is going to be a minor arterial, the blue, which is going to be a collector, the green, which is an arterial. Okay, so the red and the green are the arterial system. The blue is the collector system. Okay, and so there are roads on here that you can think of that are, defined that way, and that's how you would go into the design standard to define them by that technique. Okay, can they change? Yes. Should they change? Yes. Do they change easily? No. And so, but that is one of the standards. The next standard we look at is the terrain. Someone said slopes or grade. The terrain, we typically define that into three different classifications: level terrain, rolling terrain, and mountainous terrain. Okay. One of the things that's really nice about New York State, but at the same time causes us some grief, is that within a single, even town-sized community, we can actually have all three of these various terrains very easily. In Yates County, we had large sections of the county that were technically, by the way AASHTO defines them, mountainous. Over in the High Tor area, it's pretty steep. And mountainous isn't, big, huge mountains. It's just the terrain level versus a rolling countryside like you might see in a lot of the Finger Lakes. But you get along the lakes where there's the gullies, you can actually get what's technically mountainous terrain versus level. Most people don't realize large parts of New York State are very much level terrain, especially as you get up along Lake Ontario, obviously Long Island. Um, but it comes down to terrain. Now, terrain matters, of course, because you just can't build a road that's that flat if you're, for instance, here in Ithaca or parts of New York State. So terrain is one. And then, of course, traffic volume. And the most common ones for the local roads. So once you've gone in, you pick the local roads. These are the traffic volume ranges that you see on the local road system. So 50, 250, 400, 1500, 2000, and greater than 2000. And they've got 6 different criteria depending on those other 2 factors. So local, and then either level, rolling, or mountainous terrain. All 3 of these things together combine to give you the design speed. The design speed is not where we start, it's where we end. We get the design speed that will range, again, for most local roads, 20 to 60 miles an hour. There are some ones faster than that, but for the most part, 20 to 60 miles an hour for the local system is the design speed. And all the geometry comes from that, okay? The design speed for the vehicles that are using that particular roadway, okay? By far, the most commonly used number out of the design speed is the stopping sight distance, okay? And the criterion for stopping sight distance has changed over the years, but here's the current standard. It's the height of an eye of a driver in a sedan, which is technically listed as 3.5 feet or 42 inches above the height of the pavement, and a height of an object 2 feet above the pavement. Okay? What is an object 2 feet above the pavement? What are we trying to not hit? So in the Q&A, tell me, what are we actually defining that we don't want to hit when I am looking down the roadway? What am I trying to not hit? A small kid? Possibly. Yeah, possibly. That's not the defining item. That's possible. Someone laying in the road? Yeah, possibly. It turns out the item we're looking for is a bumper of a car. Taillights, yeah. It's a bumper of a car is sort of the criterion we're using. It used to be, and that Greenbook I showed you the picture of, the criterion then used to be 4 inches. We didn't even want to hit big rocks. We changed that back in the 90s and early aughts to a back bumper, realizing that while we don't want to hit a big rock, it's not really the justification for the stopping sight distance. So it's now 3 feet high, 2 foot for the object. And a good way to think about that, by the way, an easier thing to do is to make yourself a stick that's 3.5 feet high. And you can actually use that same 3.5 foot for passing sight distance, because in that case, we're actually using 42 in both cases. But we're not going to get into the passing too much, not really common on low volume roads. I want to tell you about a change that occurred in the last version of the AASHTO Greenbook, not the low volume one we're going to talk about, but the AASHTO Greenbook, the current version. They've added something called the decision sight distance. I like the decision sight distance concept. What they've essentially said is, if you're in an urban area or even in a rural area when there's a lot of things going on, you need to increase the decision time that people take to make a decision. Because what we're doing with stopping sight distance is we're first deciding, do you put your foot on the brake, perception, and then reaction time. Okay, so together that's the perception reaction time. And then the time to actually stop the vehicle depends on the conditions: grade, icy, rain, dry, things like that. And we define the stopping sight distance by a combination of the perception reaction time and the stopping distance of the vehicle. And the stopping distance for the vehicle is usually defined by wet pavement, okay? Not dry pavement, not icy pavement, but wet pavement. And that perception reaction time is defined by sort of what is most people's reaction time. So what do you think we use for stopping sight distance reaction times? You know, if I go back to sight distance, what is the stopping sight distance reaction time, perception reaction time, or PRT as it's listed in a lot of the documents? How long does it take, in other words, for you to see something, put your foot on the brake? And then we can talk about how quickly you stop depending on conditions. But how much time do you think? Nobody wants to take a guess. By the way, we were doing this in person, and I wish we were, and we will be soon. We're going to be starting to do things in the fall. But in person, I'd actually do a thing where you could actually win some money from me and show you reaction times. But most people's reaction times are slower than you think. 2 seconds, not uncommon. We use 2.5 in our design calculations, the perception reaction combined. And that's because a lot of the people are slower to react. Elderly people are slower to react because they've just gotten older. Younger people are slower to react because they don't necessarily recognize what's going on. So while most of us can usually react in the 1 to 1.5 second range, we use 2.5 seconds for most of our design. And the idea behind the decision sight distance is there's a lot of things going on, so we're going to add a little bit more time in an urban area. And the denser, the more complicated the background, the more time we're going to give. We may add as much as 3 or 4 more seconds. By the way, if you're on your cell phone texting, here, I'll get my cell phone out and I'll pretend I'm texting. How much extra time do you think you'd take because you've got your cell phone in your hand? How much extra time? What do you think? Five seconds. Very good, Cole. Yeah. I'll throw you a virtual coaster. Yeah, 5 extra seconds. And if you're going 60 miles an hour in a rural road, that's 90 feet a second, just about. That's 450 extra feet. So put the cell phone down for me and let's make everybody safer. Okay. So the question we always have to ask is it appropriate? Well, yes, it is appropriate for higher volume roadways. It's a very good set of standards and one we should probably be following. But if you think about it, those criterion that we come in with, they may not be appropriate when it comes to certain types of roadways. You know, sure, for arterials and collectors, it works pretty well. But when we start looking at local roads, there's some changes that occur. The traffic volumes get low enough that where some of the things we're thinking are going to happen, such as conflicts with other vehicles, really drop almost to nothing. And so, really, if you think about it, you almost have to look at roads that are above some criterion, and the criterion that was initially used was 400 vehicles per day, and I'll come back to why in a minute, versus roads under 400 vehicles per day. Okay? And there's some logic behind that. And again, we'll come back to that in just a minute. But things change when you get to lower volume. So if we're looking at the AASHTO standards for roads between 400 and 2,000 vehicles a day in a rural setting, local system, typically 2 lanes wide, the pavement width, not shoulder, pavement width, okay, ranges from 18 to 24 feet, okay. The design speed, remember, based on terrain. So the terrain behind me would be considered rolling, by the way, if you're wondering. So rolling terrain in the valley near Preble, New York. And then the width would be based upon the speed people are actually doing that comes back from that those other criterion. So there's actually a little bit of a duplication going on. And the traffic volume. Okay, so local road, the design speed, which we already got by knowing the terrain, but we can't adjust it for real world speed and traffic. So most commonly used, as I've gone around New York State, for 400 to 2,000 is probably a 20-foot roadway with a 2-foot shoulder and a 10-foot clear zone. More if you got a lot of trucks, okay? And that's fine in a lot of cases. And a lot of times that's appropriate. 20 feet wide, rural, works pretty well, okay? Is 20 feet needed on a really low volume road though? Is it appropriate? Maybe not. So here's the problem is, are we building too much up in our rural system? So let's look at, these are some data from a few years ago. They haven't changed that much by percentage. So while the volumes have gone up some, the percentages are still pretty much the same. So if we break the roads down, this is data from the state DOT by interstate, other arterials, collectors, uh, collectors less than 500 vehicles per day, and that's the number the DOT uses. Local roads, again, by that functional classification, not ownership, less than 500 and more than 500. This is the portion of roads by centerline mileage in all of New York State, okay? By distance traveled. So these are vehicle miles. So by vehicle miles, most of our vehicle mileage is either on main arterials or interstates, which makes perfect sense, okay? And local roads less than 500 vehicles per day only make up about 3% of all vehicle miles traveled, and collectors less than 500 make up less than 1%. Okay, so as an example, Tim, I know you're on here. Up in Lewis County, that road I showed, West Road or West Avenue, I can't remember which it is, that's technically, I'm pretty sure, a collector. It's a very small volume of traffic overall, but by centerline mileage, local roads less than 500 vehicles makes up over half the mileage, centerline mileage in the state. And if you combine together all of the roads that are less than 500, you're getting up towards 55% or so. And even above 500, you're over 3/4 of the mileage of the roads in the state. So back in 1992, a report was generated by the Local Roads Research and Coordination Council, and they put out a guideline for rural town and county roads. And the reason they did this was that they found the existing guidelines, i.e. the Greenbook, the existing guidelines for design and maintenance of rural highways having low volumes were not appropriate. And that's the problem, is they weren't really appropriate. They were overly wide for the roadways as were actually used and maintained. Okay? So they came up with a set of standards. This was a commission put together by the first Governor Cuomo and generated out. And they define low volume roads as under 400 vehicles per day. Okay. Now, why 400 and the state reports 500 and we all talked about 1,000? Where did all these numbers come from? Well, before we do that, let's figure out what the traffic volumes are and show you a way you can actually estimate traffic. I'm going to give you two really good ways to estimate traffic. Okay. Now, before I do that, if you own a traffic counter in your agency, raise your hand using the participant list. Raise your hand. So I got a couple. Okay. Cool. Good. There are techniques for counting traffic. Okay. So even though you own a counter, there are techniques. Do you want the whole week count? So you got to do the weekend. Do you avoid seasonality? Do you have seasonal issues? Do you do a holiday or not a holiday? And does that holiday really affect traffic volume? So you can do a traffic count, but there are techniques involved. So if you're using those, please make sure you understand that. But I'm going to give you two methods. So in the Q&A, does anybody else know how I could get the traffic volume? In this case, I've got a rural. This is actually West Avenue again, and urban intersection. How could I estimate the traffic in those two areas? Anybody got an idea? I'll give you two. My favorite two ways to do this. I'll lower people's hands while I do that. You can do a visual count. Okay. Now, it's hard to do a visual count for long periods of time. It can be done and is done. In fact, in New York City, until they got better cameras that could count from above, you were required to do visual counts. You couldn't use counters. A traffic counter in New York City has a pretty short lifespan. So you would count traffic manually. I have done that. It can be very cold in the winter, and you got to count all the turning movements, and it can be challenging, but you could do a visual count. And then you have to figure out how to translate that to a whole day, or in some cases, actually would count for the whole day. They'd have teams of people coming out and do a visual count. I'm going to show you a technique that actually makes that job relatively simple, and it deals with statistics. Best to follow it up with a good traffic counter, but this will get you close. It'll get you pretty close. And we can all do this. Go out and find the busiest time of day. Now, in your community, it may be different. Do you have a higher traffic volume in the morning when people are going to work or school? Or do you have a higher traffic volume in the afternoon when they're coming home from work or school? It could be either. Okay. And it could be a little bit of both. Typically, it's a little higher in one or the other. They're pretty close to each other. Nationally, the afternoon typically is a slightly higher commute because everybody wants to get home and do it all at the same time. Over time, that has changed some. So my number's a little bit conservative, but they'll get you in the ballpark. So what you do is you take advantage of the fact that in rural areas, the busiest hour of the day is about 15% of the traffic on that roadway. Okay. In an urban area, the busiest hour of the day is about 11% of the traffic. Okay. And you can actually take that into account. So what you do is you go out during that busiest hour and you count for just 15 minutes. You don't even have to count for a whole hour. You literally can just count for about 15 minutes. Though obviously if it's really low volume, you may need longer than that. But again, we're just looking to get us in the ballpark. And we don't need to be much more precise than that in most cases. And you can actually then turn that into the traffic count for the entire day. So if I count for 15 minutes, multiply it times 4, that gives me the 1 hour count for the busiest hour of the day, and divide it by that percentage. So in a really rural area, I divide by 0.15 or 15%. In an urban area, I would divide by 0.11. And if I'm not quite sure, I know some of you are here from the town of Ithaca, and if you're out on one of the rural roads that's suburban and you're not quite sure which it fits into, you could use 13%. It'll get you close. And then decide what you need for a counter. By the way, if you have a counter and you do this little technique as well, and there's a big discrepancy, check. It could be an issue with the counter. It could be something about the traffic that you're not aware of. Maybe there's a detour in the area. That does happen, so be aware of that fact. Now, you could do that division. You could also just use a simple factor. And again, most of the time we don't need to get down that precise. So the factors you would use for rural areas is 27. So you just take the count and you multiply it times 27. In an urban area, you would multiply the number by 36. It's not exact, but again, we're trying to get close. So as an example, okay, so let me see if my pen is being happy with me here. I'm just going to go out there and I'm going to count in the morning, okay? And I'm standing there when people are going to work, and I stand there for 15 minutes, and in 15 minutes, I count 15 vehicles, okay? So if I counted 15 vehicles, how many vehicles is that for the entire day? And we'll start with our rural area. How many vehicles is that in our rural area? Okay. So you get out your calculator, and you can either multiply 15 times 27, okay? Or if you want, you could do the longer calculation, which is a little more precise, but again, I'm not that worried about it, times 4 divided by the percentage. Okay, let's see if somebody wants to throw the answer in the Q&A, and I'm going to write the answer down on the screen here. See who's faster here. Times 4 divided by 15%. Okay. Anybody get the answer yet? 400. Very good. Yeah. You know, if you multiply the 27 times 15, it's not exactly that. It's 4 or 5. But most of the time we'd round anyway. Guess what? That's where the 400 comes from. If you do the math, you realize that if you're standing out there at the busiest time of day in a rural area and you average about 1 vehicle a minute, you're at that 400 vehicle threshold. So if it's less than 1 vehicle a minute, you're under 400. If you're more than 1 vehicle a minute, you're probably above that 400 vehicle threshold. Okay. Now, if you're close, I would advise you to do a longer count or get traffic counters out there, but you can do the math. And again, it's nice to have the simple formula. So if that same 15 was done in an urban area, you know, you could do the math, the longer one, but I can also just come in here with my trusty calculator. Okay. And I just take 15 times 36, because that's the urban number, and I get 540. Okay. So because the percentages don't flatten out as much, it's a quick way to get a traffic count. Okay. Now the other way you can do a traffic count that I also always recommend to people, and let me come back here. Not only do you have a functional classification viewer, you also have available from the state a traffic data viewer. So that's on your notes. Write down traffic data viewer. Absolutely cool tool. So I'm going to open the traffic data viewer. Again, GIS based. And you can get traffic counts on lots of roads. They're all stored into the system. And every time I look at this, I'm always amazed by some roads that have counts. The state roads, almost all have a count on them. The local system, if it has a bridge, it has a traffic count on it. Okay? So anytime you've got a bridge, you're going to have a traffic count. So let me scroll back down here into Ithaca. Okay. And the computer is going to, let's see if it's going to be nice to me today. No, it's still running. The traffic data viewer some days is, we'll try looking, okay, I'll try looking at your road That would be up in Lewis County. Okay, we'll go back. The computer is being slow right now. Okay. So I got Lewis County, and you think Brantingham. I'll search for Brantingham. It may not find it. It doesn't have every single roadway. And again, this morning it's spinning. That's why I don't rely on these things. I like to take the risk of, hey, let's take a risk and go on the internet. But the internet doesn't always agree with me. But you can search any place that's got a bridge, most county roads, and all state roads, and you'd be amazed. When I was checking this out yesterday, when the internet decided it wanted to be happier with me, I actually got a traffic count for Pennsylvania Avenue here in Ithaca, which is a local road with a very low traffic volume. I was like, wow, that has a traffic count in it. So you may be surprised. So here we go. There's Brantingham Lake, and it may come up. Okay. So it's one way to do a traffic count. I'm going to purposely go back to our slide deck. I will check this out, Tim, at the second break when the computer is happier with me, and I'll get you a traffic count and see. We'll come back and show this here in a little bit. Maybe it's going to be happier with me a little bit. I've seen that happen. For reasons that make perfect sense, I'm actually at my home office right now. So, oh, you've done it. See, you've got good internet. What'd you find, Tim? 1,200. Okay, 1,200 vehicles. And by the way, if you go to the traffic data viewer, you'll actually find information, if it was taken, on traffic, not only volume, but design volume for certain hours of the day and speed. And a lot of people are concerned about speed. You can actually get speed information in there. It's some pretty cool stuff. And we'll see if the internet comes up and is happier with me a little bit. But that's a way to estimate traffic. And that's where that 400 line comes from that you'll see a bit that comes into play. And those guidelines, they looked at 400 as being the cutoff point. Because again, they were looking at rural roads more than or less than one vehicle per minute during the busiest hour of the day. And the idea was pretty simple. 3 typical road types, keep it simple, but have flexibility. So they had an all-purpose road. They had an area service road, which is 2 lanes that might just serve residences or a farm. And then what they call the 1-lane area service road, maybe it goes up to agricultural lands or up into where there's a forest or something. Just 3 simple road types. But rather than going in with terrain and functional classification, they said, who's using the road? In other words, land use determines the design. Okay? So in terms of land use, they made a list of the different land uses that existed. So low volume collector, major roads, residential, farm access, resource industrial, agricultural, and recreational land. And you would choose from there one of the 3 classifications. Now, I will come back to this list when I talk a little bit more about a different standard. Just keep this in the back of your head. And if you're interested, this is one of the things we sent you to. You can download the guidelines directly from our website. And if you're not sure what it looks like, it's got a cover on it with a weight limit sign. It's from the Legislative Commission on Rural Resources. They still support that document. Okay. The roadway widths, the A and the B, 16 to 18 feet. Okay. 2 lanes, 2-foot shoulder, low traffic volume. Okay. Slightly wider for an A versus a B, and slightly wider if you had a lot of trucks. You'd add 2 feet or 4 feet, depending on the truck volume and the types of trucks. In other words, design the road for who's using it, not defining it by terrain and traffic volume, but by the vehicles that actually need to use the roadway. So that roadway we showed earlier, 16 feet wide, serves the needs of the people who live on it, perfectly adequate. Roadway width of type C is for that 1-lane segments, 10 feet wide. These are for really low volume, less than 50 vehicles per day. You don't even need a shoulder in that case. And that minimum maintenance road that we talked about is just fine in that case. Now let's talk a little bit about the minimum maintenance roadway. And there's two choices. Here in New York State, we have a seasonal limited use highway and we have a minimum maintenance roadway option. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But seasonal limited use highways, right now, as of today, there are no seasonal limited use highways in New York State. Think about that. Well, the way the law works, it says it's 205A, B. I always get those A and B off, but it's Section 205 of the Highway Law. And essentially what it says is that the town, technically even a county road can be this, but it's in the town law portion. You can stop plowing from December 1st to April 1st. Okay? You can only do this if there's no year-round use on that roadway. So it has to be declared by the highway superintendent by November of each year. So each year you have to look at your entire road network and define, hey, that roadway doesn't have year-round use. There's not a residence on it. There's not a farm structure that needs access in the winter. And so I can stop plowing it. If someone builds a house on that roadway right now and they get an occupancy permit, you can't declare it a seasonal limited use highway in November. You have to maintain it. You've got to resume service. And that happens quite often, more often than we'd like. There's not a huge number of them, but for a small town, that can be a very expensive operation that you'd have to deal with. The idea in the guidelines that they put out is the idea of the minimum maintenance roadway, and that comes from the Midwest. It's used quite often out there. And the idea is you can set any dates you want for any activity. You don't define just snow plowing. You might even close it in the summer. Maybe it's only roads going to a ski area. So we don't maintain it in the summer. We let it grow up and get weedy. We don't care. You still have to have no year-round use, okay? But you define the maintenance. But realize this, resuming of the service is defined by the way you set up the standards, i.e. the elected board actually defines what the standards are. And there's a process in place. And it's all done through a local law, okay? Now, there are court cases out there that have gone in both directions, whether this is legal or not. They've not gotten to the Court of Appeals here in New York State, so I cannot tell you whether they would hold up when they get there. But I can tell you the two cases that are the most current, both occurred in Lewis County with towns. In one case, they had given an occupancy permit, and the courts ruled, you gave them an occupancy permit, that defines it as a year-round use. You can't declare it minimum maintenance. In the other case, they had not, and they won that particular court case, the town did. I can't tell you what will happen later on, but again, the consistency matters. And this 12-foot wide width is fine for a seasonal limited use or minimum maintenance roadway. The bigger issue, however, is if someone did put a house on here, would you have to suddenly start maintaining it again? Now, that implementation process we talked about is part of developing minimum maintenance. You actually have to go through that whole process, not just of the roads you want to classify as minimum maintenance, but your entire road network. And that's really important because if you don't really have a basis for saying, why did you choose this road versus that road? Now, is this appropriate? Yeah, actually it is. And you can go online, you can search for Tug Hill, and you can actually find a map of the towns that have adopted this standard. Most of them are in the Tug Hill, but there are communities all over the state. The closest one here in Ithaca, for instance, that I know adopted it is the town of Caroline. If you don't have any roads that aren't used year-round, there's no point. But there is an alternative for you that might help you out. Maybe not minimum maintenance, but AASHTO put out a set of guidelines back in 2001 for very, very low volume roads, okay? Less than 400 vehicles a day. That was the official name of it. In fact, the geometric design of very low volume local roads. So it was a subset of that local roads out of the big Greenbook. Over the years, they've made some changes to it. They've added to it. As of 2019, they have a new version. Now, I will tell you, I've got a copy of it myself. Okay. It's only available digitally, but if you own the digital, you can print out a copy of it. Okay. was updated in 2019, and you'll notice a slight design change or name change. The name is now the AASHTO guidelines for low volume roads. There's still a low volume numbers in the big green book, but for low volume roads, you can actually use a standard which may be more appropriate. So let's talk about that standard a little bit. It's very similar to the guidelines. I mean, when I say similar, you'll see it's extremely similar to the guidelines. In fact, the version in 2001 used the exact same road land use types with one very minor change, which I'll talk about. The current version, they've changed a little bit more, okay? So now a question comes here. Where does the minimum 26-foot width of the New York Fire Code fall into the standards? Well, that's something you have to discuss. But remember, for 26 feet, the 26 feet includes the shoulder. Just has to be a drivable surface. And that's not a year-round use. And that's a debate. The fire people always want wider, wider, wider. But is that appropriate? It's a debate I'm not going to get into. And by the way, most agencies have roads that are under 26 feet when you get into really rural areas. It's a debate. I'm looking at it from a road standpoint. I'm also looking at it from the standpoint of, does the prism allow the truck to get up there, the fire truck? And we'll talk about geometry of curves and stuff like that when we get into the more detailed stuff here in a little bit after the next break. It's very similar to the guidelines. One thing AASHTO did do is they added in some standards for streets. So if you've got more urban or suburban street types, they've added that in. You've got more choices for widths than just the guidelines. Instead of having 3, you have a range of widths. I like that feature, but you don't necessarily have to do that. And for your own community, you may just want to adopt 2 or 3 or 4 choices. Again, look at what you've got. But the difference is land use and speed determines the design. And really, when it comes to speed, you only have 2 choices. And the low volume thing has more choices in it, more design elements, curvature, sight distance, vertical and horizontal curves, things like that. Very useful and has a wider range. We'll talk about that in just a second. So here are the rural road types that are available in the current version of the AASHTO book. As I say, in the old one, it was exactly the same. I mean, we're talking literally down to the only difference was major access replaced local collector. That was the only difference. But they did change it with this latest version. They've got 6 road types still, but they've got major access, minor access, which is very close to residential when you start reading through it carefully. Industrial commercial access, i.e. more trucks, so you got to go wider. Agricultural access, which may or may not include a farm building. If it doesn't, then you have different terms of what you might do maintenance-wise, but the width is controlled by the agricultural vehicles in the area. Recreational land access, and then finally resource recovery, which is not dissimilar to agricultural, but typically different kinds of vehicles using the particular roadway. Okay, so that's what they've got. So let's go through that a little bit to make sure we're on the same page. And whether you're using the guidelines or you're using the AASHTO low volume, they're similar enough. This is the list from the low volume rural road types out of the guidelines: collector, residential, resource, industrial, farm access, agricultural land, and recreational land. The only challenging thing here is the guidelines have the ability to have farm versus agricultural land, i.e. is there a building or not? And that comes back to this idea of the minimum maintenance, or you don't need to plow it in the winter. But from a geometric standpoint, AASHTO sort of said, nah, we're going to combine those just all agricultural lands, because that's defined by the tractors and the other farm and agricultural equipment using the roadway, the geometry. And that makes some sense. The maintenance, whether you do it or not, is defined by the time of year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a series of roadways, and you can either put it into the Q&A or just think about it, what this roadway type would be. And before I forget, I don't want to, there it is. In the handout, you've got a link, but we also emailed to you our highway standards document. Okay. We need to make some minor updates to it, change some of the front pages and things like that, but the numbers are still good. And if you scroll down on that, you can actually find the listing of the roadway types um, in the standards themselves. We're going to go through those standards after the next break, but what I really want you to understand is how to just look at and select the different roadway types. Okay. So it's not a challenging thing, but let's go through that a little bit. And we're going to do both some urban and some rural ones here. So start with the rural ones. Okay. So again, the Q&A, if you want to throw that in, what do you think this is? This roadway here. If this is low volume and it, what would you throw it into? So in the Q&A, would you call this major access? Would you call that minor, residential, industrial, agricultural? What do you think? Agricultural? It could be. It could be. And again, with a photograph, it's hard to really say. The general rule of thumb I think about this is what's the largest vehicle using it and does it connect things? Okay. So it might be a minor or even a major access, depending on where it is in your particular community, if it connects and gets everybody back to the county system or back to the state system. Okay. This particular road is actually over in Richford. And before the state highway was put in, it was the main road going east-west. But over time, with the state highway parallel, it's become either a minor or a major access route. But you might want to modify it for the agricultural use if there is agricultural use. Okay. How about this one? What do you think? Yeah, it's probably residential. In the guidelines and the standards that we've got on our website, you would define this as residential. If you're using the AASHTO standard, you would define this as a minor access roadway. Very, very similar to each other, minor and residential. Okay. Now, when we get into the numbers after the break, you're actually going to see this road's actually wider than it probably needs to be for the volume of traffic that's on it. And there's some things that the town has actually looked at doing here to improve the safety. And yes, that 20-mile-an-hour speed limit is not there anymore because there is no such thing in New York State. How about this one? What do you think this would be? Yeah, this is at Cornell. It's agricultural, but it's still a road, and it's still going to be maintained by somebody. Yeah, it's actually up above the valley up there where they got a farm, Piglet's Corner, if you know the Ithaca area at all. But it's either a agricultural land or farm access land to think about that. And again, the widths are probably not going to change too much once you get beyond the farm itself. It's defined by the vehicles using that particular roadway. Okay. But at some point, your maintenance might change. Once you get beyond where there's year round work being done, where the fields become fallow in the winter and you don't drive them, you might change your maintenance activity, even if the geometry doesn't change too much. How about this one? What do you think? Again, I know a photograph is hard to say, but you need to sort of know what is the purpose of the roadway. And that's the thing that makes these standards different than the Greenbook. It's being driven by the need on the roadway. Are there residences or not? In this particular case, where I'm standing is right across the street from a gravel pit. There's not a residence until you get down the road another half mile back towards the state highway. where I'm standing is probably defined more as either resource recovery, i.e. get to the gravel pit, or agricultural, or if you turn around, it goes up into some DEC maintained land, and that would just be recreational land access. The widths are slightly different. A little bit wider when you got resource recovery because you got trucks versus if you're up into the backwoods, you don't have typically the width of the trucks. What defines the width minimum? They need to get emergency vehicles back up in there. The idea of maybe the fire code, something like that. But that's the prism that you need to get them up there, not necessarily the main structural width. Okay. And of course, at some point, the road can get pretty narrow, but still serve the needs. Okay. And again, defining that comes down to looking at the road, driving it, looking at your whole system. And it may change in the middle, and it may or may not be worth changing the geometry, but define what the roadway looks like based upon its actual use, which is actually a good idea. Now, they did define some low volume urban street types, so I decided I would walk around Ithaca the other day and get some photographs for you. There are 4. You actually get the guidelines from AASHTO and look through them. You'll see they list 3, but then you start reading and they keep talking about this other urban. Major access, pretty simple. The main roads that have got low volume. Residential access, primarily residential. Industrial, commercial, i.e. got to have trucks. Other urban essentially means, well, it doesn't really fit one of these other 3 categories, so go look at the rural list and define it there. And most people go, well, how can you do that? Well, anybody who knows anything about driving around New York State, we have a lot of really rural type of roadways right next to urban roadways. So that's all that really means when you see that in the text. So this would be considered a major access road. Okay. What defines it is probably actually the access for the fire company at the very end more than anything else. And do they have the room to get around? A road that's almost entirely residential generally is residential. But be careful. Don't just look at what the land use is. Yes, land use defines it, but what's the worst case? Is this commercial industrial or is it residential? Depends which way you look. Again, the largest vehicle using the road would define the widths and the volumes and things like that. So would this be considered residential or industrial commercial access? What do you think? What do you think? What you're all thinking is, Dave, we're getting close to that second break. Residential, yeah, probably residential. There's a building off to the left, which is an old commercial facility that's now used for people return things there that are old, and you can get some pretty cool stuff there if you're looking for antiques and stuff. But again, look at the vehicles using it. If there was a lot of trucks, you might want to define it more commercial industrial. Okay. So again, the key is the design speeds. Instead of defining them with a whole range, it's usually high speed, low speed, more than 45, less than 45. It's pretty simple. And the way they defined it for the AASHTO local, and comes from the guidelines here in New York. They didn't give it any providence, but it's actually in the guidelines too. And I really like this feature. What it says is, if the existing road is working, leave the geometry the same. You don't need to change it. Okay? And that's actually pretty cool. I really like that. So don't change the geometry unless other factors. And we'll talk about those after the break. But the widths, 18 to 26 feet, including the shoulder. Okay? And again, that depends on, again, this access you need for emergency vehicles or for trucks or for farm equipment. Okay? And you might want a little bit wider when your roadway gets above 400 vehicles, 23 to 25 feet, again, depending on including the shoulder or not. And then finally, Streets, 18 to 38 feet, which obviously is driven by whether there's parking lanes or not. You don't have parking lanes, you might be down as little as 18 feet in an urban area, but it depends on the density and the number of channels. And if you're wondering what the number of channels means, it's not quite the number of lanes, it's more the number of vehicle sort of lanes in terms of channels of traffic that you need to take care of. I'm not going to get into the complexity of it. Most low volume roads, just look at 2 and you're going to be fine. Generally, the time you get up to having 3 channels, your volumes are high enough that you're going to be looking at the Greenbook anyway. Now, is this appropriate? Yeah, it's appropriate, but you have to define that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our second break. And while we're taking the second break, I've got a mission for you. Okay? There's something missing from the Greenbook, the little Greenbook as it's sometimes called, the AASHTO Low Volume Design Guides. I want you to think about what that might be. And I'll give you a hint to think about it. These standards, while they borrowed them from New York, were developed by people who live in the Midwest. Okay? And it's not because they were bad, they just missed it. So ask yourself while we take our break, and we'll see you at 11 o'clock. Okay? We'll be starting up in about 2 minutes. Okay, we're going to start back up. Make sure I got my things going here, actually. Start my video. There we go. So we're going to start back up, and I want to finish the discussion of what's missing from the Greenbook, and then we're going to talk about these standards that we sent out to you. We're going to use them as our guidepost as we talk about the specifics in terms of the standards. These standards here use the guidelines of the AASHTO low volume guidelines as their basis, but they include more than just some geometry. We'll talk about that a little bit. For those who are wondering, we have it on screen. I'll show you that in just a second. Now, did anybody figure out what was missing? Guess what was missing from the little green book? And the hint I gave you before the break was it was developed by people in the Midwest, Kansas City specifically. The first set was drafted by the American Public Works Association, and their headquarters are headquarters in Kansas City, Missouri, across the street from the Kansas City Hyatt, one of the more infamous places in structural engineering history in the United States. But anybody want to take a guess on what's missing from the little green book? Mm-hmm. Not the slope on the side of the roadway, the cross slope, but the grade, yeah. And it's pretty flat out there. And I don't think it's because they didn't mean to include it. It's just a blind spot. When your steepest grade is 5 or 6%, you don't think about that being a design criterion to deal with. But obviously here in New York State, we get some pretty steep grades. This happens to actually be a picture of an 18% grade roadway. And that driveway you see at the halfway point right here, that was a seasonal limited use highway. And the couple built a house with a kindergartner, and they had to spend a lot of money to upgrade that road the very year they did it because now it couldn't be seasonal anymore. And so, yeah, that's a bit of a challenge for them. So what I recommend to people to do is either develop some numbers of your own, or better yet, go use somebody else's. They're a little flatter than some people might argue for, but the state's Highway Design Manual, or HDM, which follows, as I said earlier, very close to the AASHTO Green Book, has some numbers in it. And while it goes back to that idea of the level, rolling, and mountainous, you could define for your agency the numbers that you would use. And again, the low volume guidelines only have 2 speeds, less than 45 and 45 and above. So typically I would just say, okay, for my community, I'm going to pick a couple of criteria. I probably wouldn't go all the way down to 15, but maybe you go with, if you've got a lot of mountainous terrain, 13 and 10, okay? Versus if it's more commonly rolling for most of your area, maybe you go with 8 and 10, okay? Give yourself some flexibility. Um, you probably don't need to worry too much about it for the low volume situation. So you could pick one of the rolling or the mountainous depending on your terrain. And document it. Document why you've done it. So at the end of the day, you can have an appropriate standard. You can decide to either use the AASHTO Greenbook in its entirety, and that's fine. And be honest with you, if you're with the state, you're going to use the HDM, and that's going to be the standard that you use, and that's good. It's defensible. It's a consistent standard. Great. If you would like, you could use the guidelines that were developed by the Local Roads Coordination Council, or you could use the AASHTO Little Green Book. The difference between the two is, for the most part, the guidelines have a maximum ADT, or vehicles per day, of 400, okay, average daily traffic. While the AASHTO Little Green Book goes up to 2,000. They actually sometimes, you'll see both terms used. Vehicles per day and average daily traffic, they're similar. I don't go crazy about the two. Um, the nice thing about 2000 is it really covers most roads in New York State that are in the local system, owned by local jurisdictions. And it has a cutoff inside of it of 400 vehicles between the two ends. And guess what? That's really a hybrid model anyway. And you could develop your own standards. And let me just go over to the ones we've got on our website real quick. This would be the standards that you can go with if you'd like to. You could start here, and you could always modify it to one of those. We developed this. We talked about why you need to do it, why you need to adopt standards. If somebody asks, there's some information in there. There's some sample roadway standards that this would be the actual thing you would adopt, and we're going to go through this in a little more detail here in a minute. So if you've got it with you, we can talk about these numbers. One of the things we did throughout this document is we underline things you may want to change or that typically get changed. So for instance, the name of the town, whether it's the town clerk or a county clerk or a village clerk, you might want to change those things. And the actual design criterion themselves might change some, okay? And then towards the end of this, we actually added some other features based upon your suggestions for things such as, what do you do about calculating an extended right-of-way? Or what do you do when you've got a dead-end roadway? Do you put a cul-de-sac in or a turning T? How do you do traffic counts? And finally, if you do decide you want to do a minimum maintenance roadway, we gave you some text for local law if you'd like to adopt this yourself. And again, all of that's available in the guidelines themselves. Okay. So we're going to use that. And I'm going to purposely stop right here, and we're going to go back to the slide deck. Just remind you of the implementation process. You need to adopt standards. Typically, that's done by the highway official, but in the case of the town board should adopt it as well. While you can, as a highway official, adopt these standards, the town board could override you, technically. Better do it in a joint activity since they're paying the bill, you're doing the implementation, everybody wins. You adopt them together. Classify your local roads by where they fit within the different standards. Determine the existing conditions, identify the needs to upgrade, and then develop an asset management plan to upgrade your roads just like you do anything else. And finally, develop and implement the action plan. Okay? If there's no questions on that, what I'm going to do now is I want to talk about the local road specifications. So we're going to walk through this a little bit, but I want to keep the back of my mind. Remember I said earlier, easy to understand? I'm a firm believer in the KISS principle. Okay? Keep it simple. Don't go overly crazy with your design criterion. When you download this, even with all of that extra text, the total number of pages is 33 if you count 2 blank pages in the back that we put in because it fits in the folio better and you can use it for notes. It's simple. Why is it simple? Well, a lot of it is we point to other standards. We point to the AASHTO Greenbook, the AASHTO Little Greenbook, the state's Highway Design Manual, the state specifications. Don't reinvent the wheel, and definitely don't write down something that might get changed by another standard, because that can actually lead you to problems. One of the standards that was sent to us talked about the use of clay culvert pipe. We haven't used clay culvert pipe in 50 plus years, but it had been the standard when this standard was developed. And if they just tied it to an existing state standard or national standard or some other else's, it would have upgraded automatically. So keep it simple, but have good, clear language in it. And in terms of your design criterion, well, pick ones that you can support, that you feel confident with. Now, one of the things we always recommend is if you're getting a development coming in, get them to certify it with a professional engineer stamp. Why do I, if at all possible, want an engineer to stamp something? There's 3 reasons in New York State that you want certification by a professional engineer for a set of road plans, bridge plans, anything that's engineering based. Why do I want a professional engineer, whether it's your own or an outside consultant? There are 3 reasons in New York State. What are they? Liability. That, probably the biggest one is liability. If you have a PE who stamped it, almost all the liability goes to them. Yay. Even if they work for you. It becomes a much bigger challenge if you've got an engineer stamping something, because now they have to prove malfeasance or misfeasance versus now, do you really have the standards? Get them stamped. 2, it is the law. Technically, if you're doing certain activities, you have to have a PE stamp. Anything over $5,000 by some arguments, if there's not already a set of standards you're following. In other words, if you're following the MUTCD, you can just use that. But if you step outside what the MUTCD says or these design standards say, you need an engineer to say, hey, it's okay. And then there are other places where there's specific activities where you have to have a professional engineer stamp it. As an example, if you change the structural rating on a bridge or you do something that changes the structural loading capable of a bridge, you have to have a PE stamp it here in New York State. Okay. Subdivisions and stormwater, there are not a lot of things in here on that. It's referenced a little bit. We talk about that towards the front. If I flip back over here to the spec, you'll see we talk a little bit about that in stormwater procedures. The big thing is if you're in a phase 2 area of the state, make sure that you've got that included in your design criterion. You may need to have that as a separate area to make sure you get proper things done. We are not talking about bridges, okay? Just so you know. It mentions bridges in here. The AASHTO standards mention bridges, the low volume standards, and so do the guidelines. Essentially what they say for bridges is the width of the bridge, not the span, not the structure, but the width of the bridge needs to match the road nearby. You don't want to narrow the roadway up. Makes sense. But you don't have to go crazy. But we're not going to talk a lot about bridges, not because we couldn't, but again, we've got 45 minutes and we're not going to get into a lot of detail. So what I really do want to do though is get a conversation started, which is really hard to do remotely, but I'm hoping you guys can help me out. So let's talk about clear zone. Now again, if you've got the guidelines have a number that we recommend in here. Okay. But what clear zone width would you use in your community? What do you think you would have as your clear zone width? So again, put it in the Q&A. What do you think you'd like to see for a minimum and a desirable clear zone width? at least the highway right-of-way, minimum of 20 feet, okay? You don't have to put in a specific clear zone for every single road. Both the guidelines and the AASHTO Little Green Book have clear zone numbers, and you could just refer to them, okay? You'll think I'm crazy for low volume roads with some of the numbers you're throwing out here. But the general rule of thumb in the guidelines and the AASHTO Little Green Book, you're going to love this. 2-foot minimum, 10-foot desire, wider where needed. And if it's really low volume, 2 feet is maybe all you need. Now you're probably thinking, because a lot of you put in there 20 feet, 25 feet, 10 feet on each side. How many of your own roads actually meet that criterion today? I'm not arguing that we wouldn't like wider clear zones. Clear zones are improvements in terms of safety. But the reality is, most of our low volume roads, we don't have that clear zone. But it turns out we may not need that clear zone. The traffic volumes are very low. The speeds relative to an arterial collector are lower. So our chances of crashes do go down some, okay? But the standard of the 30-foot clear zone that you may have seen in some comes from some testing done where vehicles could drive off into a test area and they didn't have to worry about stopping. There was nothing to hit. So in those cases, they did wind up about 30 feet. But we'd like wider, but we have to be consistent. Consistency is the bigger thing. So set a criterion. That could be the right of way. It doesn't have to be. What's really interesting is municipalities, especially towns and villages, have the power to set a clear zone even outside the right of way and not allow certain things to get into that clear zone, even if it's out of the right of way. It has to be for all your road system to do this, but it can improve safety quite a bit. And what is that clear zone defined as? It's defined as the distance from the edge of the pavement to the first fixed object. So if you've got a shoulder, that's part of your clear zone. Okay. So what about overgrowth preventing snow melt on certain roadways? Well, that's one reason we like clear zones is we can have a good canopy so we can get sunlight in there to help dry things out, thaw them out in the spring. And oh, by the way, if you've got a canopy and it starts to encroach downward, you could have a hard time getting a vehicle through, a truck or a fire truck or your snowplow, because it hits the canopy. You actually have the right to remove that within the prism, okay? And that right-of-way prism depends on roads by use. It can be very confusing. But yeah, you have a right to that prism up in here, okay? Don't make it any wider than you need, but yes, it can help quite a bit. But the clear zone is to the front face of any trees or things like that. Once you've defined your clear zone, do me a favor. Be pretty consistent about it. I mean, this is nice and pretty as a mailbox, but boy, if you hit that, that's going to be a really, really bad day. And again, I'm going to come back to this again through the rest of our time together. Consistency really helps improve safety. Consistency really helps improve communication. Consistency helps in a lot of ways. Don't let people put things in the right of way. They're going to create a serious or fatal crash. Okay? I mean, if you're going to take trees out, trees are the number one thing hit in rural and even urban areas. It's the number one killer when we drive off roadways are trees. Be consistent with them. Get your clear zone when you can. Don't put them on four slopes. Get them up away when you can. But when you do cut them down, cut the whole tree. Don't leave stumps. Take it right down to the ground. You don't necessarily have to grind them out, but make them flush. What is the maximum height that you want anything sticking out of the ground that could actually stop a vehicle? What's the maximum height? Anybody know? 4 to 6 inches. 6 is too high, actually. 4 inches maximum. Anything above 4 inches can snag a small car. So keep it under 4 inches in height. And better yet, flush. Okay? And again, You don't have to go crazy in a rural roadway. Here's somebody put a fence. It's on the inside of the curve. I'm a little concerned about sight distance, but not that concerned. It's low volume, relatively low speed. The people driving it all live there. Okay, so not bad. And by the way, the clear zone doesn't just have to be trees. The clear zone in this particular case is here. If vehicle gets any further off that roadway than uh, the edge of that shoulder or whatever that is, they're in trouble. They're going to have themselves a really, really bad day. That's part of the clear zone too. The clear zone is traversable, and that's too steep. Um, so I'll come back to this ditch in a little bit. Now, today, I know this is in our standards. We have a minimum roadbed thickness. Okay, we say at least a certain thickness in our standard. Okay, and we ask for a certain design life. Why would we want a minimum thickness? For a brand new roadway, why would I want a minimum thickness? And I'm not talking structure. Why would I want a minimum thickness no matter what? Why would I want a minimum thickness? Freezing thawing issues could be an issue. It comes back to operations and maintenance. If you don't have a minimum thickness, it's really hard to get drainage to work. It's hard to maintain a gravel roadway because over time gravel roads tend to sink. So you want a minimum thickness. And it's just constructability and maintenance operations. How thick is that number? Okay, if you'll notice in here, what we put down there is a minimum thickness. Let me find my sheet. 18 inches combined thickness. You could lower that. If you're in a really rural area, not a lot of traffic, you could say 12 inches. Pick your number. We put in 18, okay? And my pen decided it didn't want to finish my 8. It wasn't a very good 8 anyway. I'll do an 18 over here. How about that? There we go. 18 inches. Okay? And the minimum design life, the design life, we'll talk a lot more about that next week. But the design life should be the cycle for total reconstruction. And so keep that number. We're going to come back to that number. We actually recommend in here, I think we said 20 years. Okay. But that includes your maintenance, by the way. That's not 20 years, don't touch it. That's with routine maintenance. We'll talk a lot more about this next week. And I'll be honest with you, 20 isn't long enough. That's the minimum. You may want to go higher. We'll talk about that more next week. The key is to build the roads to handle the loads. And roads are a structure. And we're talking geometry today on the surface. Next week, we'll be talking more about the pavement design thickness. I think everybody here is signed up, but if not, we can talk about that more, but when we talk next week. And remember, what's going to drive our thickness is going to be the vehicles that are on it, whether it's paved or unpaved, okay? Now, this is an issue that is a geometric and an operations and a maintenance one all at the same time. So that's why I want to talk about a little bit today. Okay, we'll talk more next week about it. And that's the surface type. And I said we'd talk about this some. When do we decide to go from unpaved to paved and back sometimes to unpaved or depaving as it's sometimes called? You've got to look at a whole bunch of issues. You need to obviously look at the traffic. That traffic line, as I say, there are reports anywhere from 4 vehicles a day is the low end I've seen from a legitimate group that just didn't have a beef, up to over 1,000 vehicles a day. Okay. And if you can't make next week, you'll still have the materials. We can still get you those, and some of the tools will still be available as well. But the traffic volumes can range a lot. In the guidelines, they talk about 150 vehicles a day. That's actually probably a pretty good number for most of New York. But I can tell you right now, if you get into hilly terrain, that number goes down. It's actually less expensive long term to pave those roads sometimes when they get really steep because they lose so much gravel due to vehicles going up and down and due to erosion. And that's what usually drives it, is things like that. You got to look at safety issues and drainage, and of course cost. How much do you have to maintain it? What are your standards? Public opinion is part of it, but one of the big mistakes we make a lot of times when we take a road from being unpaved to paved, we change all the geometry. So we really don't have an apples to apples comparison. You don't necessarily have to make the road wider and straighter just because you chip sealed it or paved it. And then do you have a plan, and is there a commitment to follow that plan? If you don't, it can get very challenging. And in terms of which, at the end of the day, I'm a big fan of long-term cost. And if you do our long-term cost, that includes your initial cost to rebuild it, your maintenance cost, the cost for the users. A rough road costs them more money, and the opportunity cost. And we could spend the whole rest of the time together talking about that. But I do want to point out one really, really important thing. Again, as I said, in the back of that gravel maintenance and design manual, it's on our website under publications. You can actually look up a good detailed list. But let's look at the gravel itself. Okay. These are data that we generated literally long before I came, and we continue to tweak and look and modify it. But what it comes down to is the mixture of material you're using to build the roadway should be 50 to 70% gravel. That's where the strength comes from, the big particles. It needs to have some sand in it to help compact it. And in terms of the number of fines, clays and silts, if you're underneath the surface, this one says 10%. That's what you see in a lot of places. We actually recommend these days 8%. Okay? And be honest with you, if I had my druthers, I'd like to see that down under 5% if I can get it. But again, whether it's available or not, the cleaner the better. Above 8%, it becomes frost susceptible. So that's why we like 8%, and the cleaner is better. But you need some fines on your surface. Okay, and that's the key to remember. You need some fines on the surface. So if we look at this in a chart form, for our base roadways, we want to be in the blue. For our surfaces, we need to be in the dashed zone. And what happens an awful lot of times is we take a roadway that had been properly maintained as a gravel roadway and holding up pretty well, but traffic volumes go up, and so we chip seal it or we pave it. Please be very careful about that. That's not a structural issue. That's a design issue. This roadway was chip sealed. The fines content was 13%. And less than a year later, it blew itself apart. If you've got a dirty base, it's going to have problems. Good gravel surface, poor quality base. Okay. And when trying to decide between A, B, C, and D, you got to look at the cost. And you need to include not only the cost of any materials you're going to bring in, but in any invoices you get from a contractor, but your own labor and equipment. You have to include them to be able to do an apples to apples comparison. Now, we did a project. We looked at a couple of town roads, and we looked at the cost of 3 different surfaces for a road that was in about the 400 vehicle range, 275 actually, if I remember correctly. So it was, can't draw today, 275 vehicles per day. Okay, there we go. And so in that particular case, let me get that out of the way because I know my text is going to show up on here otherwise. A gravel road was costing, this particular was a town, about $1.42 per square. If they chip sealed it after cleaning up the gravel and either replacing it or stabilizing it, they could actually get the price down to $1.34. But if they went ahead and paved it, it would actually cost them more money. Okay, so they didn't need the structure. They didn't need to go all the way up to a paved roadway. They could get away with a good chip seal after they cleaned up the gravel. Now that was for a road, as I say, 275. But you start getting higher than that, it might change some. So keep that in mind. You can actually run these calculations, and after next week, I'll show you some tools on how you could do that and get a sense of what you really need. Okay. Now, terms of driving speed. Okay. Now we remember the AASHTO guidelines gave us two driving speeds, 0 to 45, and then greater than 45, right? You may want to set a minimum speed on all of your road system. Okay. In the standards, we actually said a number. What number would you want as a minimum speed on all of your roads? And what would you want to have on most of your roadways? You can actually define that in your calculations. You can say, what's the minimum design speed? Okay. Because that affects your sight distance, that affects your intersection triangles, it affects a lot of the geometry comes back to driving speed. And so while we design around 0 to 45 and greater than 45, for sight distance, we need to define a minimum speed. So what would you want to have for a minimum speed on your road system or your street system if you're in an urban area? Any thoughts or ideas? 35, some people like 35, yeah. 30 is probably the most common because of the fact that 30 is the most common speed limit in urban areas in New York State. Okay. Now, if I go around the country and I'm talking to people, 25 would become the number that you'd see. Nationwide, the most common is 25 because that's actually the number that's used in most of the country for defining low speed versus high speed. But here in New York State, and through the magic of what I can do here, I can erase this. And did it erase? It did. Hey, magic eraser there. Um, 30 miles an hour is the most common. Okay. But then you might want to say uh, some mile an hour on most roads. You could actually define it by class if you want to. So maybe you could say it would be 45 for most of your roadway system. And then any roadways that are above the 2000 threshold that are in the AASHTO book, maybe you say those have to be 50 or 55 miles an hour to match the state speed limit. I can tell you right now when it comes to driving speed, the biggest thing I always look for is consistency. More than anything else, I want to be consistent because that really improves safety. You want your corners to have the nice widen on the inside. You want to get rid of dips and dives. Create good sight lines. Now, a lot of people think, well, if you take a roadway like this one that has a dip and you can't quite see the distance here, but from where I'm standing to the top of this knoll is something on the order of 250 feet, if I remember correctly. It's pretty short. We came in, there was actually a double dip over a culvert. We came in and we cleaned that up. And so we put in here a much straighter roadway, flattened it out. And then lots of people, oh my, they're going to go faster. The speed before and after went up by less than 5 miles per hour. But the improvement in sight distance, the chances of a vehicle, or worse yet, in this case, there were Mennonites in the area, their buggy literally being hidden from view until you were 250 feet away, went from pretty high to pretty low. So consistency matters. And think long term, okay? This happens to be a town that's got a long bridge. They actually have to maintain the bridges themselves. They're thinking when we have to replace this bridge, we're actually going to come in here and bring the roadway over to this spot, flatten that out, make it easier to maintain. But they're looking long term. They're going ahead and doing some of the right of way work now. Before I forget, I did look it up over the break. Let me get back over here to the computer, traffic data viewer. And Tim, I looked up your roadway. This is the traffic data viewer for the Brantingham County Route 42. And they have an ADT of 1,194. So it's above the 400 threshold, but it's under the 2,000. But again, I always like to look at both things. And I love the fact that you can get some speed numbers in a lot of cases. Not every case, but you can get speed numbers and see what people are actually doing. And you may find it's slower, or faster than you might think. So again, pretty cool tool to look at. Now, what is the right of way? What do you want the right of way to be as a minimum in your standards? What would you like this, in our standard? What do we want for the minimum right of way? The state standard talks about 3 rods. There's a unit we all use every day. Everybody knows what a rod is, right? 4 rods? Yeah, 4 rods. So what's 4 rods, Tim? I'm going to ask you now. What's 4 rods? Very good, 66 feet, because a rod is 16 and a half feet. What? Okay. Uh, I usually use 60. That's what we put. Again, you can put this in your standards. 60 feet, you could put 66 or 4 rods if you prefer. But the bigger thing, I think more important, is put a minimum, at least certain width, but realize it not only should it be variable, but it really should be wider in a lot of cases. Now we'll come back to existing roads in just a second, but let's talk about a brand new roadway, okay? In this case, you want a nice flat slope. It's safe. You got the bottom of your ditch, and then you come back up on a flat slope going the other direction. The right-of-way shouldn't just be defined as 66 feet, which I don't know the 66-foot distance. I know the 60-foot, 30 feet from the center line, okay? That only puts me about here. I really want my right-of-way at the top of that slope, way up here. In the guidelines, we gave you a chart that shows you that calculation of how to do that, okay? Assuming a back slope of 211 and a foreslope of 211. I actually like to go even flatter on the foreslope. I like my foreslope of 411 or flatter if the ditch is more than 3 feet deep, because I don't need guide rail. It's stable. It's easy to maintain. Better yet, it's easy to mow. So you may want a variable width, minimum, and then go wider. Now that's for new roads, but what about your existing roadways? What are you going to do in a case like this? I told you I'd come back to this ditch. What are you going to do here? Any ideas? What am I going to do here? Nobody's going to be brave? Yeah, you're probably going to have to start thinking about guide rail. Yeah, you may have to. This actually was a shallow ditch. They dug it out. I still don't know why. You can tell where the edge of the right-of-way is. It's up here. It's the top of that slope. That's the right-of-way. If we need more width, we have to think about it. I know politically it's difficult, but it might be better off to go wider. Or you have to think about rail, or what they did in this case was actually cheaper than rail, but actually in the long run, just leaving the swale would have been better. They actually filled in with pipe, okay? So they actually put in a pipe underneath, filled the whole ditch in, so now if you run off, you're just on grass. It can be done. I actually like the filled ditches in. It's not a bad concept. It really does work well. Do you do perforated pipe? It depends on the need. In this case, at the top of a slope, you probably don't need to, but yes, I actually like perforated pipe. But remember, a lot of times it might be pretty big. If you're doing anything larger than the 6-inch standard perforation, go get an engineer to help you with the hydraulics and make sure it's going to work well. And you're not going to actually bring water to the roadway and what's the bedding and all that stuff. By the way, if you're wondering, you see that tree there? That tree survived. In fact, that's the tree right there, that pine tree. It's thrived in the 10, 15 years since they did this. But again, right of way should not be our defining thing, but I know it is. But think about that. If you can get wider, that's better. So the width, again, that's the nice thing about having a set of guidelines. You can follow that guidelines, but you can also say, yes, I know those are the standards, but I want a minimum width of X. Okay. So what number would you put in there? Well, that would depend. So you could say a minimum of 20 feet in your community, and we actually put that in there. But I can tell you right now, if you've got a lot of rural roads, you don't need 20 feet. Don't put 20 feet down unless you're going to enforce it, unless you're going to follow it. If you say total roadway width of 20 feet on my 2 lane and maybe 10 feet on others, you could actually then do it that way by just putting in, say, maybe 10 and 20 in there. Okay. And if you're concerned about fire safety, maybe you put some other things in there in terms of that. You can develop your own standards from others without a lot of effort, but start with somebody else's because they take some of the liability. Okay. Now let me show you a village street. This is a village, not a town. It looks like a town road, but it's actually a village street. That's a pretty wide village street. Why do you think they've got this extra width? And we're talking from the edge of that little swale over here in front of the utility poles to over here to the edge of the asphalt. We're talking almost 28, 29 feet. And it's, I think, 5 houses on this street. Dead end, it doesn't connect to anything. And yet, that isn't appropriate. It could be for turning your truck around. Maybe you got to turn around at the end. This isn't part of the truck turnaround. That's behind me. They do have a snowplow turnaround back there behind me, but they needed the extra width. That's why it's so important to know the land use. Power company access, very good guess. That's extremely good. It's not correct, but that's only because it's different access. The idea is let the land use define what you need. In this case, the sewage treatment plant was behind where I'm standing. While the main access was on the other side, to really get into the sludge tank area, you needed to come in the backside with an extra wide piece of equipment about once every 4 or 5 years. So while most of the time they didn't have to do it, they needed the extra width. They only paved, as you can see, a narrower width. In fact, when we got done, they sort of realized, we could probably even pave less and just leave an extra wide shoulder when they need it now and then. But again, let the land use define everything. Now, drainage facilities, you're going to put in larger pipes for more important roadways. You're going to put a larger pipe in underneath the roadway, and you probably should define a minimum size pipe. Why would you define a minimum size pipe? What reason would you have for a minimum size? And what number would you put in for a minimum size? We have a recommendation, but other agencies I know go with a different number. What's the minimum size and why the minimum size? Some people say 6, some say 15 because it's easier to maintain. Yeah. That's generally what drives the minimum size is your operations and maintenance. You don't want it to plug up. Okay. If you've got flushing equipment that's 15 inches or you're concerned about freezing, you want to put 15, that's fine. If you want to put 12, that's what we put in here. But I'm not saying you should do 12. You should put in the number that matches your operations. I wouldn't like to go less than 12 just because it doesn't take that much to put a 12-inch pipe in. But underneath the roadway, maybe you have a different size minimum. Maybe the driveways are 12 and under the road is 18. The big key is you set a minimum size and then you design for certain flood frequencies. Now, we had some recommendations, the state DOT had some recommendations, and about 3 or 4 years ago, we actually worked with the folks in local projects to harmonize those two sets of numbers. I will tell you right now, to be totally honest, they had different numbers than we did. We didn't come to the same place. But at the end of it, we do. We have a set of consistent standards. And remember, consistency is important. So if you look in the standards we've given you, you'll see a table that has design flood frequencies in it. I'm not going to go through it because we don't have the time. But you can pull that up. It's the exact same chart the state has now in their highway design manual. Okay? So there's a consistency to it so that the culvert underneath a roadway handles certain size floods. Okay? And it defines it by local A, B, and C, those same standards that are in the guidelines. So what's the minimum design storm that you want to be able to handle? And it's going to be different depending on the type of roadway. You could either follow this chart or you could set your own. So for the very low volume roads, you might only need to have, even for a culvert, You might only need to have a 10-year storm or a 10% storm. Okay? So a 10-year or a 10% storm that you're handling. Okay? But that's assuming you're not on a dead end roadway, because in a dead end roadway, you probably need to have a larger pipe. Okay? Whoops. Didn't mean to switch you there. But different size storms for different conditions. So your storm drains, how often do you want to let them flood? You may not even have them in a rural area, but maybe you could do a smaller one. Even a 5-year is probably enough in a lot of cases. A driveway, maybe a 10-year minimum. And these are the numbers we have for the AB type roadways. You could set a larger size if you want. But again, are you going to use that same standard on your own for your own road network? If you are, great. If not, you may want to modify your standards slightly. Now, we're not going to have much time today to talk about the installation of pipes. We're talking about geometry, but I always try to remind people of drainage and how you install pipes matters. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go forward. Um, keep that as the top of your queue. And remember, when you're checking existing pipes out, just go upstream and downstream and put a pipe between the two. So while we have design storms, see what's already out there. Again, same thing with the overall guidelines. The existing road works, you're probably good. If you're not sure, go get some help. Now, in terms of signs, what sign standard do we follow here in New York State? What sign standard do we follow? The MUTCD, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, and the most important word in there is uniform. And here in New York, we have the National Uniform Manual, and there's a New York State supplement to the MUTCD. You have to follow both. Most of the time, the national controls, but there are some exceptions. So, for instance, exceptions that we like here in New York is we're allowed to use a slightly smaller street name sign for 30 miles an hour, while the national says you have to go down to 25 miles an hour, because again, our most common speed limit is 30. So you need to check both out. Now, we do have a handbook. You're probably aware of it on called the Traffic Sign Handbook. It covers about 90% of the signs in rural areas and most signs in urban that aren't parking signs. But technically, you still need to be following the MUTCD. That's just a guide to help you out to save you some time and trouble. And if you need a copy of that, you can go on our website or let us know. We can get you one. But the key is signs. The public doesn't know what the volume is. The public doesn't care even. So you really need to sign all of your roads following the MUTCD because, again, that U is the single most important word, the uniformity in the system. Because we don't want something like this. That's an actual work zone when they were working on a bridge. They're working on it again, and this time they've actually signed it better. Okay? Now, I would have actually done something like a curb sign ahead of it with some chevrons, but at least they put in the proper barricades and they haven't made it look like some, what does that mean? Sharp bend? Huh? So again, think about consistency even in your work zones. Um, Snow and ice control, uh, we don't think about that as being part of our standards, our geometric standards, but they should be because the largest, and next week when we talk about the heaviest vehicle on our road is our snowplow. It's allowed to carry extra weight, and guess what? It goes out in the middle of the spring. So you may want to include thinking about dealing with snow and ice control when you're developing your geometric standards. What are your operations set up to do? Do you want to allow an unpaved road if all of your road network is paved? Probably not. Do you need extra width because you've got larger trucks because most of your roads are already pretty wide, so maybe you need bigger intersections. So again, things to think about, to put into your standards. Now, what standards? Clear and easy to understand, meets the needs of the public, and it's used for all roadways. And now, are you going to use AASHTO? Are you going to use the Little Green Book? Are you going to use the guidelines from the Local Roads Coordination Council?
Are you going to use the standards that we've got on our website? You can pick that from that list, but do me a favor, think about it, adopt them, and then start to use them for all of your road network. Now, to end this time together today, we're going to do a couple of questions, technically for the PDHs, and a couple of geometric case studies. Not going to take a lot of time, but I do want you to think about a few things. So, first, a couple of PDH questions, and then we'll do the case studies and get us done here right about noon. Okay? What critical heights are used in stopping sight distance? Do you remember? What are the critical heights? You can throw that in the Q&A. 4 inches, 3.5 feet, 2 feet. Okay, okay, pretty good. Okay, so the numbers that we've got, the height of the eye, the driver, is 3.5 feet, 42 inches. Okay, so if you're out on a roadway and you're trying to determine sight distance, you need to bend down and get down to 42 inches. We actually recommend doing that with you just make yourself up a stick at the right height. Okay, so you put your eye right above the stick, you're at the right height already set to go. Height of the object is going to be 2 feet, and it's the bumper of the car. Yeah, very good. The old 4 inch number we don't use anymore. So it's 3.5 and 2 feet. Okay. And I want to remind you that when you're looking, you may want to increase your distance for decisions in an urban area, even on the low volume road system. It's not necessarily a bad idea. So you may want to look at the full Greenbook in that particular case. There's some good stuff in the new Greenbook dealing with that issue. Now, the other one, I hope you remember, what geometric standard is missing from the little Greenbook? Grades. Yeah. Not cross slope. Cross slope is actually surprisingly in there. When it comes to that, I'll show you the answer for the question. We'll talk about cross slopes here in a minute. What's missing is the grades, centerline grades of the roadway, the maximum grade, longitudinal grade, because of mountainous steep curved terrain. So what do you need to do? Go to something like the Highway Design Manual from the state or the AASHTO Green Book itself. Pick some grades from there and justify why you're using them. Add them in. Okay. What you're going to use depends on where you are. If you're in Alabama, and yes, there is a town of Alabama here in New York State, you probably can just use it as is. It's very flat country up there. You don't have to worry about it. But if you're down here in Ithaca or up in Lewis County or you're down in the Catskills, you may want to pick a grade. And generally, for most municipalities, you would pick two grades, one for the higher speed, one for the lower speed, and choose the worst case for your agency. Though, again, if you're a large county or a large municipality or you have huge variations, you could even have variations depending on terrain type. Now, in terms of cross slope, there's a lot of stuff in here about cross slope in all of these guidelines, and we'll just quickly run over there. So I'm just going to open up, in this case, I want to open up the Greenbook here. There's whole tables in there that talk about cross slope, okay? And I'm just going to quickly scroll down because it's not that big. That's the roadway width. There's horizontal alignment stuff. Okay, and then we have here side friction factors, just like in the main Greenbook. And those side friction factors depend upon the cross slope that you're dealing with. Super elevation rate for curves, but even for crowns you can talk about. You've got there. Generally, the grade, by the way, is defined by the surface type. So if it's a paved road on a straight tangent section, you're talking about a 1/4 inch per foot or 2%. If you're on gravel road, you need a little steeper, 3/4. So when you get a steep hill situation like this, you may actually want to flatten it out a little bit so you don't get erosion at the edges. Okay. So again, you would set your standard. Okay. So what I want to do, I've got a few minutes here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you two case studies. I'm going to give you a rural one, and then we're going to do an urban one. Okay, so here's our first one. Okay, and in this particular situation, obviously it's a rural road. Okay, and traffic volume, I went out there and counted in the morning. I got 12 vehicles in my 15-minute count. I saw some agricultural trucks. As I drove up and down the road, there were a few residents. So I want you to tell me the traffic volume I need to deal with. So where do I fit in the criterion? More than or above 500 or way down really low? And what land use would you choose? Okay, and to help you out, I'm going to give you both the AASHTO choices, which is over here on the right, and I'm going to give you the guidelines choices, the ones developed here in New York State on the left. Just take a couple of minutes, do the calculations, and then when you're ready, put in your number for the traffic volume and tell me which uh, land use type are you going to be dealing with. Okay, so somebody's already done the volume calculation, and you use the multiplying factor, I see. Somebody else got 324, and they said it was agricultural land, which that's what you'd use in guidelines. Okay. Okay, so depending whether you use the percentage or you use just the multiplier, it's going to either be 320 or 324. Very good. And it's going to either be agricultural land. Yep. Again, from a photograph, you can't tell. Somebody put in recreational land. It could be. Uh, that's why you need to know your own community, and you define every road in your community that way. And yes, it can change. Okay. If, for instance, up on the left, there was a gravel pit, you might need to define it as that, because the largest vehicle using the road is going to define the width. So if you got a lot of trucks, you might want to go a little wider than it was purely residential in nature. Okay, so keep that in mind. So those are your two choices on that side. Okay, any questions on that? You would then pull out your standard, pull from that, and be in good shape. And by the way, when you adopt these standards, if you have no urban core, or the urban core you've got is always on a state or a county road with a higher volume, you don't have to adopt that portion. So you just do the guidelines and move on. But if you do have urban stuff, like for instance here in Ithaca, you may need to adopt two different sets of standards, one for urban, one for rural. So let's look at an more urban situation. Okay. In this case, we got an urban situation. We've got 31 vehicles in a 15-minute count. While I'm standing there, there's a bunch of school buses going by, some delivery trucks, people driving, some residences, um, land use. Now, in this case, there's only one choice. It's the land use choices from the AASHTO guidelines, or the low volume guidelines, because this isn't included in the guidelines developed here because they were developed for rural areas. While I prep my last cup of coffee here before the noon break. Okay, so again, if you could do the calculations, tell me how many vehicles per day. Oh, I'm running out of creamer. Oh no, tragedy. And then what would you choose for land use? So you calculated 1,027. Okay. Again, you might get a slightly different answer depending on whether you do this with a uh, the percentage or the straight multiplier. But yeah, so between just over 1,100 vehicles per day. So that means you're well above the 400 threshold. Okay. And again, most people agree. I agree it's residential, but that's why it's important to watch and see what's out there, what's going to define and drive everything. And that, of course, for an existing road, what would happen is it depend on, do people park on the roadway? And obviously in this case they do. So is it wide enough? You could watch it and see do people have to weave. And if they're okay with that, you're good. You may even be able to narrow some roadways up. It's not politically always easy to do, but could actually be a very useful thing to think about. Okay. Remember, this is the urban one, so you're going to use 11% or the multiplier of 36. Okay. Versus the other one, which is 27 as a multiplier. So that's this week's on geometry. It's a brief overview of what's available to you. Again, please pick a standard. If you are able to join us next week, we're going to be talking about pavement thickness design for lower volume roadways. And there's some limitations of, again, just like there is for this, where you shouldn't use it. In this case, for geometry and even for thickness, you get above 1,000, you start getting near the edge. 2,000 is the upper limit. So 2,000 is the upper limit for the stuff we provided to you per day. That's still a lot of your road system. And most of the guidelines and the really low volume stuff is 400 vehicles per day. And last question, how many vehicles a minute is 400 vehicles per day in a rural area? How many vehicles per minute is 400 vehicles per day? Which really low, very low volume is defined. One, or 15 cars per 15 minutes. Yeah. With that, I'll stay on for a minute or two if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, we'll let you go. We'll get a certificate of attendance if you stayed for 3/4, and if you need the PDHs, you're at 90%. You'll get that as well. We'll send those out in a few days um, once you've paid. Don't remember if we're charging for PDHs. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Have a good day, everybody. And as I say, I'll stay on for about a minute or two if you have any questions. I think they all went to lunch, Amanda.
All right, I'll boot them all off.
Yeah, we can boot them off. Nobody's asking any questions. So,
Jason raised his hand.
Up. Jason raised his hand. Well, let's see what. Jason, you have a microphone? I'll allow you to talk. Up, you muted himself again.
Oh, that might have been me.
Somebody said, don't call a penalty on my son. Yeah, I'm waiting for hockey season to start again, too. Jason, you have a question? Nope, maybe not. Okay. Well, sounds good. Oh, here goes. Is there an evaluation procedure we can follow to determine when to pave a road? Yes. I'll tell you what. It'll take me just a second. Let me just do this. Under our website, under library, under publications, you scroll down near the bottom, you'll see a couple of miscellaneous publications, and then publications by other agencies right at the bottom. And there's two in here, Gravel Roads Maintenance Design Manual and the older 2000 version. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click on this. And this is the website. I'll throw it in the chat pod. So you'll need to go to the chat pod, or you can just go to our website. And this is some errata. So let me get past the errata. It looks like this. And it's got a pretty good procedure, the steps to think about, those 10 steps. And let's see how good my memory is. I'm going to scroll near the bottom. And it's probably still downloading because my internet speed at home is not as fast as this is at work. And let's see how I did here. I know I'm making everybody dizzy. Nope, I went too far. Nope, I'm not. My memory is not good today, Joe. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I'll actually look at the table of contents real quick. Oh, that's right. I'm in here. Section Appendix D 115. When to pave a gravel road. Okay. And you can go through and give you the steps, a series of questions to evaluate, to ask. And then when you've got those questions answered, then you can decide when and how to go about doing the process. It's a pretty good procedure. There's no exact number, I will tell you right now, but it's a good set of steps to go through. And if you do that, you should be in pretty good shape. I would use that too, by the way, to unpave a road too, to depave, just steps in reverse. Okay? That help you out, Joe? Looks like it does. I hope. Yep, good. Well, if you have any questions on any of that, feel free to give us a holler. There's my email address. And with everybody else, I'm going to let y'all go, and I'm going to get my lunch as well. Thanks, Amanda, for all the help.
Not a problem.
Okay.